She is falling. Blonde hair whipping in the wind, arms outstretched, mouth open in a scream that the rushing air swallows whole. The water below is black and hungry, and it is rising to meet her faster than any human mind can process. Gwen Stacy is falling, and in this moment she's not thinking about how she got here. She's not thinking about the cackling madman on the glider above. She's not thinking about the boy she loves, the boy who wears the mask, the boy who tried so hard to keep her safe from exactly this moment. She's thinking about nothing at all, because terror has emptied her completely, and all that remains is the fall. Above her, Spider-Man screams her name. His voice cracks. It breaks. It sounds nothing like the wisecracking hero who swings through Manhattan trading quips with criminals. It sounds like a boy, a desperate, terrified boy watching the only thing that matters plummet toward oblivion. He is already diving, already firing. The webline shoots from his wrist with mechanical precision, the same motion he has performed 10,000 times before, and it arcs through the night air, silvery and sure, reaching for her, reaching. It catches her ankle. The line goes taut. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, something breaks. Not the web. The web holds. The web has always held. The web is the one thing Spider-Man has always been able to trust, the extension of his will made physical, the thread that connects him to the city he protects. The web holds perfectly. It is Gwen's neck that snaps. The sound is small, almost delicate, a sound that should not be able to carry over the howling wind and the distant crash of waves against the bridge's foundation. But Peter Parker hears it. He hears it with the same impossible clarity that lets him sense danger before it arrives, that lets him dodge bullets he cannot see. He hears the sound of Gwen Stacy's spine separating, and in that instant something inside him dies, alongside her. He hauls her up. His arms are trembling. His whole body is trembling. She is so light. She has always been so light, so delicate, and he has always been so careful with her, so afraid of his own strength, so terrified that he might accidentally hurt her, with hands that can bend steel and shatter concrete. And now she hangs limp in his arms, and her head lolls at an angle that heads should never loll, and her eyes are open, but they are not seeing him. They are not seeing anything. Gwen? His voice is a whisper, a child's voice, a prayer to a God who is not listening. Gwen, please, please, Gwen, wake up. You have to wake up. But she does not wake up. She will never wake up. And somewhere above him, the Green Goblin is laughing. That high, shrieking, inhuman laugh that has haunted Peter's nightmares for years. The laugh of Norman Osborn fractured and rebuilt into something monstrous. And the Goblin is circling on his glider like a vulture, watching Spider-Man cradle the corpse of the woman he loves, and he is laughing because this is exactly what he wanted. This is victory. This is revenge. This is the Green Goblin proving once and for all that Spider-Man cannot save everyone. Cannot save anyone. Cannot even save the one person who mattered most. Peter looks down at Gwen's face, at the face he has memorized, at the face he has dreamed about, sketched in the margins of his notebooks, watched across crowded lecture halls and quiet coffee shops, at the face of the woman who saw past the awkwardness and the secrets and the endless excuses, who loved Peter Parker before she ever knew he was Spider-Man, and something inside him catches fire. Not grief, not yet. Grief will come later, in the quiet hours, in the empty apartment, in the dreams that wake him screaming. What rises now is older than grief, darker than grief. It is rage, pure and primal, and it fills every cell of his enhanced body until he is vibrating with it, until his fists are clenched so tight that his knuckles crack, until the only thought left in his mind is a single burning imperative: kill him. The words echo through his skull as he lowers Gwen's body to the bridge with hands that are somehow still gentle, still reverent, even as the rest of him transforms into something he has spent his entire heroic career refusing to become. He pulls the mask tighter, he rises to his feet, and he looks up at the Green Goblin with eyes that have forgotten mercy. Tonight, he will come closer to murder than he has ever come before. Tonight, a hero will stare into the abyss and feel the abyss reach back. Tonight, the Green Goblin will learn that there are worse things than death, and one of them is what Spider-Man becomes when he has nothing left to lose, But this is not where our story begins. This is the middle, the breaking point, the moment that shattered a man and remade him in scar tissue and sorrow. To understand how Peter Parker arrived at this bridge, cradling the body of the woman he loved, we must go back before the mask, back before the webs, back before the radioactive spider and the desperate wrestling matches, and the uncle who died because a boy was too selfish to act. We must go back to Queens, to a modest house in Forest Hills, to a child who lost his parents before he could remember their faces, who was raised by an elderly couple with more love than money, who grew up brilliant and lonely and utterly unprepared for the weight that destiny would place upon his shoulders. We must go back to the beginning. We must go back to Peter Benjamin Parker. The house on Ingram Street was never quiet. Not because of noise, but because of presence. Because of the way Aunt May hummed while she cooked, old songs from her youth that she never quite remembered all the words to. Because of the way Uncle Ben's laughter rumbled through the walls like distant thunder, warm and steady and safe. Because of the creak of the third step on the staircase and the rattle of the pipes in winter and the particular way the afternoon light fell through the kitchen window, painting golden rectangles on the faded linoleum floor. This was the house where Peter Parker learned what home meant. But it was not the house where he was born. Richard and Mary Parker were ghosts long before Peter was old enough to understand what ghosts were. He had photographs, of course. A wedding portrait that Aunt May kept on the mantel, showing a handsome man with Peter's jaw and a beautiful woman with Peter's eyes, both of them smiling like people who believed they had their whole lives ahead of them. He had stories, too, carefully curated tales that his aunt and uncle parcelled out like precious gifts. Your father was brilliant, they told him, a scientist. Your mother was brave, so brave. What they did not tell him, what they could not tell him, was the truth. Richard and Mary Parker were not simply scientists. They were operatives. Central Intelligence Agency, deep, cover, the kind of shadow work that leaves no fingerprints and no forwarding address. They had spent years dancing on the razor's edge between nations, gathering secrets that could topple governments, building networks of informants and allies in the cold, dark spaces where the world's real power struggles played out. And then, one day, they boarded a plane that never landed. The official story was mechanical failure, a tragic accident. These things happen. The real story involved a man named Albert Malik, a Soviet agent who had once worn the mask of the Red Skull, and a betrayal that was decades in the making. Richard and Mary Parker were assassinated, their plane sabotaged, their bodies never recovered from the wreckage. They died as they had lived, in shadow, in service, in silence. Peter was 4 years old. He would not learn the truth about his parents until he was a grown man. And by then, he would have accumulated so many other tragedies that this one would feel almost quaint, almost manageable, just another scar in a landscape of scar tissue. But that was later. In the beginning, there was only the house on Ingram Street, and the elderly couple who opened their door to a frightened little boy and gave him everything they had. Benjamin Parker was not a rich man. He had worked with his hands his entire life, moving from job to job, factory floor to warehouse, to wherever honest labour could be found. His back ached when the weather changed. His knuckles were thick with calluses. He had never finished college, never climbed any ladder, never accumulated the kind of wealth that the world uses to measure a man's worth. But Ben Parker was rich, in the only currency that actually mattered. He was rich in kindness. May Parker was his perfect complement. Where Ben was sturdy, May was gentle. Where Ben told jokes and slapped backs and filled rooms with his booming presence, May moved quietly, noticing the small things, the hidden things, the wounds that people tried to conceal. She could tell when Peter had been crying before he walked through the door. She could sense when the weight of the world was pressing down on his narrow shoulders, and she always knew exactly when to offer a plate of wheat cakes and a listening ear. They were not his parents. They never pretended to be, but they loved him like he was their own blood, and in the end, that was more than enough. Peter Parker grew up in the shadow of absence. He grew up knowing that somewhere out there in the great and terrifying world beyond Forest Hills, something had taken his mother and father away from him. He did not know what. He did not know why. But he knew that the world was capable of theft on a cosmic scale, that love was no protection against loss, that even the people who should have been permanent could be erased without warning. This knowledge made him careful. It made him quiet. It made him the kind of child who watched from the edges of playgrounds, who memorized the exits in every room, who built walls around his heart without even realizing he was doing it. It also made him brilliant. Peter's mind was a furnace. It burned through textbooks and encyclopedias and library cards with an appetite that bordered on obsession. By the time he was 8, he was correcting his teacher's math. By the time he was 10, he was building rudimentary electronics in the basement, circuit boards and radio receivers and other projects that made Uncle Ben shake his head in bemused wonder. By the time he reached Midtown High School, Peter Parker was operating at a level so far beyond his classmates that he might as well have been speaking a different language. And that, of course, was the problem. High school is not kind to brilliance. High school is a hierarchy built on conformity, on athletic prowess, on social navigation skills that Peter had never learned, because he had been too busy reading about quantum mechanics and organic chemistry. He was small for his age. He wore glasses that slipped down his nose. He spoke in complete sentences and used words that his classmates had to look up. He was, in every measurable way, a target. Flash Thompson was the arrow. Eugene Thompson, known to everyone as Flash, was everything Peter was not. Tall, handsome, athletic. The kind of golden boy who moved through the halls of Midtown High like a minor deity, collecting admirers and accolades with the effortless grace of someone who had never once doubted his place in the world. He was the quarterback. He was the homecoming king. He was the center of gravity around which the entire social universe of the school revolved. And for reasons that Peter never fully understood, Flash had chosen him as a personal project. The bullying was relentless. It was creative. It ranged from the casually cruel, books knocked from hands, lunch trays accidentally spilled, insulting nicknames shouted across crowded hallways, to the more elaborate torments that Flash seemed to design specifically for Peter's humiliation. There was the time he was locked in a supply closet for 3 hours, the time his science project was destroyed the night before the fair, the time Flash and his friends cornered him behind the gymnasium and made very clear what happened to nerds who forgot their place. Peter endured. What else could he do? He was small and weak and utterly alone, a single fragile point in a constellation of indifference. The teachers did not see, the other students did not care, even the few who might have felt sympathy kept their distance, unwilling to risk their own social standing by associating with the school's most reliable victim. So Peter retreated, into books, into experiments, into the inner world of his own mind, where he could be anyone, where the laws of physics were more reliable than the laws of adolescence, where brilliance was a virtue rather than a curse. He dreamed of escape, of college, of laboratories, of a future where his mind would finally be valued instead of mocked. He dreamed of proving them all wrong, every last one of them, of becoming something so magnificent that Flash Thompson and all the others would have no choice but to acknowledge what they had overlooked. He never dreamed of becoming a hero. He never dreamed that the universe was already preparing to give him exactly what he asked for, and to extract a price so terrible that he would spend the rest of his life paying it. But for now, Peter Parker was simply a boy. A lonely, brilliant, wounded boy who came home every afternoon to a modest house in Queens, who ate wheat cakes at his aunt's kitchen table, who listened to his uncle's stories about responsibility and character and the measure of a man. With great power, Uncle Ben liked to say, usually when Peter was complaining about homework or chores or the fundamental unfairness of the teenage condition, comes great responsibility. Peter would roll his eyes. He would nod along. He would file the words away in that vast warehouse of his mind and promptly forget about them. He had no power. What could those words possibly mean to him? He was about to find out. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, a field trip, a science exhibition at Empire State University, showcasing the latest advances in radiation research. Peter had signed up the moment he saw the flyer tacked to the bulletin board outside the chemistry lab, his hand trembling slightly with an excitement he could not quite contain. This was his world. This was where he belonged. Not in the hallways of Midtown High, dodging Flash Thompson's fists and the cruel laughter of classmates who would never understand him, but here, in the Cathedral of Knowledge, surrounded by people who spoke his language. The exhibition hall was everything he had hoped for and more. Towering displays of particle accelerators and radiation chambers, diagrams explaining the behavior of isotopes and the decay of unstable elements, scientists in white coats moving between exhibits, answering questions with the patient enthusiasm of people who had dedicated their lives to understanding the universe's smallest secrets. Peter drifted through the hall in a kind of trance, his notebook filling with sketches and equations, his mind expanding with every new piece of information. He barely noticed when the rest of his class grew bored. He barely noticed when Flash and his cronies started making jokes at his expense, their voices carrying across the hall in deliberately audible whispers. Puny Parker, science nerd, probably going to marry a test tube. Peter ignored them. He had learned long ago that reaction only fed the beast. Better to disappear into the work, into the wonder, into the questions that actually mattered. He was standing beneath a display about radiological mutation when it happened. The spider was small, unremarkable. A common house spider that had somehow found its way into the demonstration area, perhaps drawn by warmth or light, or the simple blind instinct that governs all small creatures. It had crawled across one of the radiation devices, an experimental apparatus designed to bombard organic matter with controlled doses of radioactive particles, and it had absorbed a lethal quantity of energy in the process. The spider was dying. Its tiny body was saturated with radiation, its cells breaking down, its brief existence measured now in minutes rather than days. But it was not dead yet, and in its final moments, driven by pain or confusion or some impulse beyond human understanding, it descended on a single silk thread from the ceiling above. It landed on Peter Parker's hand, and it bit him. The pain was immediate, sharp and hot like a needle dipped in fire, and Peter jerked his hand back with a hiss of surprise. He looked down to see a tiny red welt rising on his skin, already beginning to swell, and the crumpled body of a spider falling to the floor, dead before it hit the ground. Peter rubbed the bite absently. It throbbed. It burned. But he had been bitten by spiders before. Who hadn't? And he thought nothing of it. He returned his attention to the exhibits, to the equations, to the world of clean and comprehensible science that had always been his refuge. He did not notice the way his vision blurred at the edges. He did not notice the cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He did not notice the way his legs began to tremble, as if the muscles beneath his skin were rearranging themselves according to some new and alien blueprint. By the time the field trip ended, Peter Parker was barely conscious. The walk home was a fever dream. The streets of New York swam around him, buildings stretching and compressing like reflections in a funhouse mirror. Sounds were too loud. Lights were too bright. His skin felt like it belonged to someone else, tight and strange and humming with an energy he could not name. He stumbled. He caught himself against a lamppost and felt the metal bend beneath his grip. That was wrong. That was impossible. But Peter's mind was too fogged to process impossibilities, and he kept walking one foot in front of the other until he finally collapsed through the front door of the house on Ingram Street and dragged himself up to his bedroom. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke, everything had changed. The first thing Peter noticed was the ceiling. He was staring at it from an angle that made no sense, his perspective skewed in a way that defied geometry. It took him several seconds to realize that he was not lying in his bed. He was clinging to the wall above it, his fingers and toes adhering to the plaster with an effortless grip that required no conscious thought. He screamed. He fell. He landed on his mattress with a bounce that should have hurt but didn't, and he scrambled backward until his back hit the headboard, staring at his own hands like they belonged to a stranger. What was happening to him? What had that spider done? The experiments began immediately. Peter was a scientist, even in terror, and scientists tested hypotheses. He touched the wall again, and stuck. He pulled away, and released. He climbed to the ceiling, hung upside down, scurried across the plaster like the very creature that had bitten him. His hands adhered to any surface. His body responded to commands he did not consciously give. That was only the beginning. His reflexes had become something beyond human. He could sense danger before it arrived, a tingling at the base of his skull that warned him of threats he could not see. When Aunt May accidentally dropped a glass in the kitchen, Peter caught it before it fell an inch, his hand moving faster than his mind could follow. When a car nearly struck him crossing the street, he leaped clear with a grace and power that left him standing on a fire escape 2 stories above, heart pounding, mind reeling. He was strong, unbelievably, impossibly strong. He could bend, steel bars. He could lift automobiles. He could punch through concrete without feeling pain. The scrawny body that Flash Thompson had tormented for years was gone, replaced by something lean and powerful, something that hummed with coiled potential. Peter Parker had become something more than human, and for the first time in his life he had options. The wrestling posters caught his eye a week later, a cash prize for anyone who could last 3 minutes in the ring with a professional. Easy money, quick money, money that could help Aunt May with the bills, money that could buy him equipment for his experiments, money that could finally give him some small measure of control over his own destiny. He built a costume, crude at first, just a mask to hide his identity. He called himself the Spider, and he stepped into the ring to claim what the world owed him. For the first time in Peter Parker's life, the power was his. He had no idea what it was about to cost. The money was intoxicating. Peter had never held so much cash in his life. Crisp bills, counted out by a promoter with nicotine-stained fingers and a smile that never reached his eyes. 3 minutes in the ring. That was all it took. 3 minutes of toying with a man twice his size, a man who had no idea that the skinny kid in the cheap mask could have ended the fight in 3 seconds if he wanted to. Peter had drawn it out. He had played to the crowd. He had discovered something new about himself, something that tasted like copper and adrenaline. He enjoyed the power. The television appearance came next. A variety show, always hungry for novelty acts, had seen footage of the masked wrestler who called himself the Spider. They wanted him on camera. They wanted to see what he could do. And Peter, drunk on attention and possibility, had agreed. The studio lights were blinding. The cameras were everywhere. Peter performed for them like he had never performed for anyone, climbing walls, lifting impossible weights, demonstrating reflexes that made the audience gasp and cheer. For one shining moment, he was not puny Parker. He was not the bullied boy from Queens. He was something magnificent, something special, something that the world could not ignore. He was still riding that high when the thief ran past him. It happened in the hallway behind the studio. Peter was counting his payment, already calculating what he could buy, what he could build, how much he could give to Aunt May without making her suspicious. He heard the commotion before he saw it, shouting, the thunder of running feet, a security guard's breathless cry for help. The thief burst through a door not 10 feet from where Peter stood. A nondescript man in a dark jacket, face twisted with desperation, a bag of stolen cash clutched to his chest. He saw Peter. Peter saw him. For one frozen instant their eyes met. The security guard was right behind, panting, too slow, too old, too out of shape to catch a younger man with fear, fueling his legs. He saw Peter too, saw the masked figure with the impossible abilities, saw salvation. "Stop him!" the guard shouted. "For God's sake, kid, stop him!" Peter did not move. The thief ran past, close enough to touch, close enough that Peter could have reached out with one hand and ended the chase before it began. His enhanced reflexes screamed at him to act, to intervene, to use the gifts he had been given, but Peter Parker was tired of being everyone's solution. He was tired of being used. He was tired of a world that had never given him anything and now expected him to give everything in return. So he stood aside. He let the thief go, and when the security guard staggered up to him, gasping for breath, face red with exertion and fury, Peter simply shrugged. "Not my problem," he said. 3 words, 14 letters, the most expensive sentence Peter Parker would ever speak. He went home. He had dinner with Aunt May and Uncle Ben. He laughed at his uncle's jokes and complimented his aunt's cooking and felt, for perhaps the first time in his adolescent life, like everything was going to be okay. The money was real. The future was bright. The power was his to use however he saw fit, and he had chosen to use it for himself. He went to bed that night with a smile on his face. He woke to sirens. The sound cut through his dreams like a knife, dragging him from sleep into a reality that felt wrong before he even opened his eyes. Red and blue light strobed through his bedroom window. Voices drifted up from the street below, urgent voices, frightened voices, the particular cadence of tragedy unfolding in real time. Peter was at the window before he knew he had moved. Below, the street was chaos, police cars, an ambulance. Neighbours gathered on the sidewalk in bathrobes and slippers, huddled together against the late-night chill, their faces masks of shock and sorrow. And in the centre of it all, illuminated by the harsh glare of the emergency lights, Aunt May stood alone. She was screaming. Peter did not remember running down the stairs. He did not remember pushing through the front door, shoving past the officers who tried to hold him back, fighting his way to the centre of the crowd. He only remembered the moment he saw Uncle Ben. The old man lay on the pavement. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. There was blood, so much blood, pooling beneath him, black and glossy in the artificial light. His chest was still. His hands were still. Everything about him was still in a way that living things were never still. And Peter knew, in that instant, with a certainty that would never leave him, that Ben Parker was dead. Shot. A robbery gone wrong. A carjacker who had chosen the wrong victim on the wrong night. The details came in fragments, delivered by police officers whose voices seemed to reach Peter from a great distance. Ben had been coming home from the store. He had surprised the thief. He had tried to be brave. It had cost him everything. Aunt May was still screaming. Someone was holding her. Someone was trying to offer comfort that could not possibly be enough. Peter stood frozen, staring at the body of the man who had raised him, the man who had taught him to ride a bicycle, the man who had stayed up late helping with homework and told terrible jokes at the dinner table, and never, not once, made Peter feel like anything less than a beloved son. Gone, stolen, erased from the world by a stranger's bullet. Something inside Peter Parker broke, and something else caught fire. The police were talking about the killer. They knew where he had gone. An abandoned warehouse near the waterfront, surrounded, nowhere to run. They were organising a response, calling for backup, doing everything by the book. Peter did not wait for the book. He was in his room in seconds, pulling on the crude costume he had worn for his wrestling matches. The mask, the dark clothes, the identity of the spider, which had seemed like a game just hours ago and now felt like armour. Like purpose. Like the only thing standing between Peter Parker and complete collapse. He went out the window. He moved across the rooftops with a speed and fury he had never known he possessed. His spider sense guiding him through the night, his muscles burning with the need to act, to strike, to make someone pay for what had been taken from him. The warehouse loomed out of the darkness. Police lights flickered in the distance, but they were too slow, too far away. This was Peter's hunt now, Peter's justice, Peter's kill if he wanted it to be. He wanted it to be. The thief was inside. Peter could sense him, a small, frightened heartbeat hiding in the shadows, waiting for a chance to escape. He dropped through a skylight, landed in a crouch, rose to his full height with fists clenched and eyes burning behind the mask. The man saw him and screamed. He tried to run. Peter caught him in 2 steps, lifted him off the ground with one hand, slammed him against the wall hard enough to crack the plaster. The thief's gun clattered to the floor, forgotten, useless. There was nothing between them now but Peter's rage and the fragile barrier of a single human life. "Please," the man whimpered. "Please. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to hurt anyone." Peter's fist drew back. One punch. That was all it would take. He could feel the power coiled in his arm, the terrible potential waiting to be unleashed. One punch, and this man would never hurt anyone again. One punch, and Uncle Ben would be avenged. One punch, and Peter Parker could... He saw the man's face. The moonlight streaming through the broken windows caught the thief's features, illuminating them with terrible clarity. And Peter recognized him. The same desperate eyes, the same nondescript face, the same dark jacket now torn and dirty from his flight. This was the man from the studio. The man who had run past Peter in the hallway, the man Peter could have stopped with a single gesture, a single choice, a single moment of basic human decency. The man Peter had let go. The fist did not fall. Peter's arm dropped to his side like a puppet with cut strings, and he released the thief, let him crumple to the floor, stepped backward until his shoulders hit the opposite wall. The rage was gone. In its place was something worse, something colder, something that would never fully thaw no matter how many years passed or how many lives he saved. Guilt. Uncle Ben was dead because Peter Parker had been too selfish to help, too arrogant, too convinced that his newfound power existed only for his own benefit. He had let a killer walk free, and that killer had walked straight to Forest Hills, straight to the man Peter loved most in the world, straight to a destiny that should never have been. The police arrived minutes later. They found the thief bound in webbing, unconscious but alive. They found Spider-Man gone, vanished into the night like a ghost. They did not find Peter Parker until the funeral 3 days later, standing in the rain beside his aunt, staring at a freshly dug grave, carrying a weight that would never lift. With great power, Uncle Ben had told him, so many times, in so many ways, comes great responsibility. Peter understood now. God help him. He finally understood. He made a vow that day, not aloud. Aunt May was weeping and the words would have felt obscene, but silently, in the depths of his soul. A promise to the man beneath the earth and to the frightened boy who still lived inside him. Never again. Never again would he stand aside. Never again would he let selfishness cost an innocent life. Never again would Peter Parker choose comfort over duty, safety over sacrifice, the easy path over the right one. The spider had given him power. Uncle Ben had taught him what that power meant, and Spider-Man was finally truly born. The first costume was an embarrassment. Peter knew it even as he stitched the final seams, hunched over Aunt May's ancient sewing machine in the pale hours before dawn. The fabric was cheap. The colours were uneven. The mask pulled awkwardly across his face, and the eye lenses he had fashioned from one-way mirror material sat slightly crooked, giving him a permanent expression of mild confusion. It looked like what it was, a teenager's desperate attempt to transform himself into something larger than life. But it was his. Every thread, every stitch, every imperfection. They belonged to Peter Parker, and they represented something that no amount of money or professional tailoring could have provided. They represented choice. They represented commitment. They represented the decision to stop hiding from the world and start fighting for it. The web shooters were different. The web shooters were perfect. Peter designed them in a fever of grief-fueled inspiration, the equations flowing from his mind like water from a broken dam. Twin devices, compact enough to fit beneath. His costume sleeves, capable of firing a proprietary adhesive compound that he had synthesized in his basement laboratory. The webbing was strong enough to support his weight, flexible enough to form nets and shields and binding restraints, and biodegradable enough to dissolve within an hour of deployment. It was, without question, the most sophisticated piece of technology Peter had ever created. It was also a weapon, a tool, an extension of his will made manifest, connecting him to the city in ways that his wall-crawling and strength alone could never achieve. The first night was terrifying. Peter perched on a water tower in Queens, staring out at the glittering sprawl of Manhattan, and felt the full weight of what he had chosen settle onto his shoulders. The city was vast. The city was hungry. The city was filled with 1,000 dark corners where cruelty flourished and innocence suffered, and he was one teenager in a homemade costume with no training, no backup, and no idea what he was doing. He jumped anyway. The web caught a flagpole. The arc carried him over the street, wind roaring in his ears, stomach dropping with the thrill of freefall. For one glorious instant, Peter Parker forgot his grief, and his guilt, and his fear. For one instant, he was pure motion, pure freedom, pure possibility. Then he missed his next anchor point and crashed into a fire escape hard enough to leave a dent in the railing. Learning to be Spider-Man was a process of constant failure. He misjudged distances. He overestimated his strength. He swung into clotheslines and stumbled off rooftops and once, memorably, got his webbing tangled in a flock of startled pigeons that left him hanging upside down over 42nd Street while tourists took photographs. His spider sense warned him of danger, but it could not teach him how to fight, and his early encounters with common criminals were messy, chaotic affairs that left him bruised and bleeding and questioning every choice that had led him to this moment. But he kept going. Night after night he returned to the streets. Night after night he learned. His body adapted. The enhanced reflexes that had once felt foreign became second nature, allowing him to flow through combat like water around stones. His strength, properly controlled, let him disable opponents without killing them, a distinction that Peter held sacred, even when the rage inside him screamed for blood. His agility turned the urban landscape into a three-dimensional playground. Every wall a pathway, every gap a shortcut, every shadow a place to hide and strike and vanish. The villains came quickly. The chameleon was first. Dmitry Smerdyakov, a master of disguise who had been impersonating officials and diplomats across the city. using his gifts to steal secrets and sell them to the highest bidder. Peter stumbled onto his operation almost by accident, following a hunch that led him to a warehouse full of latex masks and stolen documents. The fight was brief. The chameleon was no physical match for Spider-Man, but it taught Peter a crucial lesson. His enemies would not always come at him with fists. Some would come with lies. Some would come with faces he trusted. The Vulture came next. Adrian Toombs, an elderly engineer who had developed an electromagnetic harness capable of granting him flight. Toombs had been cheated out of his life's work by a corrupt business partner, and he had responded by becoming something monstrous, using his wings to terrorize the skies above Manhattan and rob anyone foolish enough to cross his path. Peter fought him twice before finally bringing him down, learning the hard way that age meant nothing when your opponent could dive bomb you at 60 miles per hour. Then came the Tinkerer, the Enforcers, the Living Brain, a parade of threats both mundane and extraordinary, each one testing Peter's limits in new and painful ways. Through it all, he maintained the double life. Midtown High did not pause, for heroism. Homework did not complete itself while Spider-Man swung through the night. Aunt May did not stop needing groceries or medicine, or the quiet reassurance that her nephew was safe and sound in his bedroom, rather than dangling from a skyscraper with a broken rib. The exhaustion was constant. Peter attended classes with bloodshot eyes and bruises hidden beneath long sleeves. He fell asleep in study hall. He missed deadlines and failed quizzes and watched his academic standing, once his only source of pride, begin to crumble under the weight of his nocturnal responsibilities. And still Flash Thompson tormented him. Still the popular kids laughed. Still the world saw only puny Parker, the weakling, the nerd, the target. Peter could have ended it. One demonstration of his strength, one public revelation, and Flash would never bother him again. But that was not the lesson Uncle Ben had taught. Power was not for revenge. Power was not for ego. Power was for protection, for service, for the people who could not protect themselves. So Peter endured. He took the jokes and the shoves and the humiliation, and he told himself that it did not matter, that the mask was where he truly lived now, that Spider-Man was more real than Peter Parker had ever been. The lie almost destroyed him, because the truth was simpler and sadder. Peter Parker was lonely, desperately, achingly lonely. He had no one to share his burden, no mentor to guide him, no fellow hero to watch his back when the odds turned against him. He was a 16-year-old boy carrying the weight of a city on his shoulders, and some nights, in the quiet hours before dawn, he wondered if the weight would crush him before the villains ever could. But then the sun would rise, Aunt May would call him down for breakfast, and Peter would remember why he fought. For her, for Uncle Ben's memory, for every innocent person walking the streets below, unaware of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, unaware of the masked boy who stood between them and the darkness. Spider-Man was a hero, and heroes did not quit. The headline screamed from every newsstand in Manhattan. Spider-Man, hero or menace? The question mark was a formality. J. Jonah Jameson had already made up his mind. The Daily Bugle occupied a towering edifice in the heart of the city, a monument to ink and influence that had shaped public opinion for generations. Within its walls, reporters chased stories, and editors chased deadlines, and the great machinery of journalism ground forward with relentless momentum. But at the top of that tower, in an office perpetually clouded with cigar smoke and righteous fury, one man held absolute dominion. John Jonah Jameson was not a subtle creature. He was loud. He was bombastic. He was possessed of a voice that could shatter glass and a temper that could curdle milk at 50 paces. His moustache bristled with perpetual indignation. His flat-top haircut stood at attention like soldiers awaiting orders, and his hatred of Spider-Man burned with the intensity of 1,000 suns. No one knew exactly why. Theories abounded, whispered in the Bugle's hallways and debated in the city's bars. Some said it was jealousy, that Jameson resented a masked vigilante receiving the adulation that he believed should flow to legitimate authorities, to men like his son John, the celebrated astronaut who had risked his life for his country without hiding behind a costume. Others suggested it was simpler than that. Jameson distrusted masks on principle, believed that anyone unwilling to show their face must have something to hide. The truth, like most truths, was more complicated. Jameson had spent his entire career fighting for transparency. He had exposed corrupt politicians, crooked businessmen, criminals in three-piece suits who thought their money made them untouchable. He believed in accountability. He believed that power, unchecked, inevitably corrupted. And here was Spider-Man, a figure of tremendous power who answered to no one, who operated outside the law, who could be hero or villain depending on nothing more than his own whims. That terrified Jameson, and fear, in a man like him, always transformed into fury. The editorials were merciless. Day after day, the Bugle's front page featured Spider-Man in the worst possible light. Every accident was his fault. Every escaped criminal was evidence of his incompetence. Every act of heroism was reframed as vigilante overreach, a dangerous precedent that would surely lead to chaos if left unchecked. "Spider-Man threatens city," the headlines blared. "Masked menace strikes again." And Peter Parker, reading those words over breakfast while Aunt May tutted about the state of the world, felt something inside him wither. He was trying so hard. He was sacrificing everything, sleep, grades, friendships, any hope of a normal life, to protect a city that seemed determined to hate him. And this man, this cigar-chomping blowhard, who had never once put himself in danger, was systematically destroying his reputation with nothing more than ink and spite. It was maddening. It was demoralizing. It was also, in a twisted way, an opportunity. The Bugle needed photographs. Jameson's crusade demanded visual evidence, images of Spider-Man in action that could be splashed across the front page with appropriately damning captions, and no photographer in New York could get the shots that Peter Parker could get, for obvious reasons. Peter walked into the Bugle offices on a Tuesday afternoon, a portfolio of photographs tucked under his arm, his heart hammering against his ribs. The newsroom was chaos, phones ringing, reporters shouting, the constant clatter of typewriters like machine gun fire. He felt small. He felt young. He felt utterly out of place in this temple of adult ambition. But he also felt desperate. Aunt May's medical bills were mounting, the house needed repairs, and Peter's options for legitimate employment were limited by his age, his schedule, and the inconvenient fact that he spent most of his nights being punched by supervillains. Jameson hired him on the spot. The photographs were that good, clear, dynamic, perfectly framed shots of Spider-Man in action, capturing angles that should have been impossible for any ordinary photographer to achieve. Jameson did not ask how Peter got them. He did not care. All he saw was ammunition for his war. The irony was exquisite. Peter Parker, the secret identity that Spider-Man fought so hard to protect, was now profiting from pictures of himself. Every check Jameson signed funded Peter's crime fighting. Every headline meant to destroy Spider-Man's reputation, instead paid for web fluid and costume repairs. It was absurd. It was unsustainable. It was the only option Peter had. The Bugle became a second home. Peter learned to navigate its rhythms, to anticipate Jameson's moods, to deliver photographs that satisfied the publisher's hunger without completely betraying his alter ego. He met Betty Brant, Jameson's secretary, a dark-haired beauty with sad eyes and a gentle smile, who became Peter's first real workplace crush. He met Robbie Robertson, the editor-in-chief whose quiet integrity served as counterweight to Jameson's bombast, who sometimes looked at Peter with an expression that suggested he suspected far more than he let on. And he learned, slowly, to see Jameson as something other than a monster. Because beneath the bluster, beneath the headlines and the hatred, J. Jonah Jameson was not evil. He was a man of principle, twisted though those principles might be. He genuinely believed he was protecting the city. He paid his employees fairly, fought for press freedom, donated to charities when no cameras were watching. He loved his son with a ferocity that bordered on obsession, and that love had curdled into resentment of anyone who achieved heroic status without earning it through legitimate channels. He was wrong about Spider-Man, profoundly, dangerously wrong. But he was not a villain. Peter never forgot that distinction. In a world increasingly populated by monsters in human form, Jameson remained stubbornly, infuriatingly human. An antagonist, yes. An obstacle, certainly. But also, in some strange way, a reminder that good people could believe terrible things. The crusade would never end. For as long as Spider-Man swung through the city, J. Jonah Jameson would be there to condemn him. The headlines would keep coming. The reputation would remain forever tarnished. But Peter Parker would keep selling photographs, and Spiderman would keep saving lives. Some battles could not be won, they could only be survived. Norman Osborn was a man who had everything: wealth beyond imagination, power beyond measure. A corporation that bore his name and stretched its tentacles into every corner of the global economy. Oscorp Industries manufactured weapons and pharmaceuticals, chemicals and technology, anything that could be sold to governments and corporations hungry for an edge over their competitors. Norman sat at the centre of this empire like a spider in a web of steel and glass, pulling strings, crushing rivals, building a legacy that would outlast him by centuries. He had a son, Harry, a handsome boy with his mother's eyes and his father's ambition, though the ambition in Harry had been stunted somehow, twisted by years of neglect and impossible expectations. Norman loved his son the way he loved his company, as an extension of himself, a reflection of his own glory, a project to be optimized rather than a person to be cherished. Emily Osborn, Norman's wife, had died when Harry was young. Some said illness, some whispered darker things. Norman never spoke of her. He had locked that grief away in some iron vault of his psyche and thrown away the key, and what remained was a man carved from ambition and ice. He had everything, and it was not enough. The Goblin formula was supposed to be his masterpiece, a performance-enhancing serum derived from years of research into human potential, capable of increasing strength, speed, intelligence, and healing to superhuman levels. Oscorp's military contracts depended on its success. Norman's legacy depended on its success. He had invested millions, sacrificed researchers, cut every corner and broken every rule to bring the project to fruition. The early tests were promising. Lab animals demonstrated remarkable improvements: faster reflexes, greater endurance, accelerated cognitive function. But they also demonstrated something else, something the research team tried to bury in footnotes and appendices, hoping Norman would not notice. The subjects were going insane. One by one, the enhanced animals turned violent. They attacked handlers. They attacked each other. They attacked the walls of their cages with a fury that seemed to transcend mere aggression, as if something inside them had broken, some fundamental governor that separated thought from impulse, reason from madness. Norman noticed. Norman always noticed. But Norman also saw the potential, and potential was worth any price. He ordered the human trials to proceed. When his own researchers refused, citing ethical concerns and legal liability, and the basic moral prohibition against experimenting on human beings with an unstable compound, Norman made a decision that would echo through history. He would not trust this work to cowards. He would not let lesser men determine the fate of his legacy. He tested the formula on himself. The laboratory was empty. The hour was late. Norman Osborn stood alone in the sterile glow of fluorescent lights, a syringe in his hand, his reflection staring back at him from a dozen darkened screens. He felt no fear. He felt no doubt. He felt only the pure, crystalline certainty of a man who had never once failed to achieve what he set out to achieve. He pressed the plunger. The pain was immediate and absolute. It tore through his nervous system like lightning through a tree, igniting every cell, rewriting every synapse. Norman screamed, a sound that echoed off the laboratory walls and died unheard, and collapsed to the floor as his body began to transform. When he woke, he was no longer alone. There was someone else in his mind now, a voice, a presence, a dark and gleeful passenger who saw the world through eyes unclouded by conscience or hesitation. This new Norman, this other Norman, looked at the empire he had built and saw not a legacy but a cage. He looked at the rules that governed society and saw not order but chains. He looked at Spider-Man, the masked hero who had been making headlines across the city, and saw not a nuisance but a challenge, a worthy opponent, a mirror, a toy to be broken. The Green Goblin was born. The costume came first. Norman's fractured mind, now operating on multiple levels simultaneously, designed something theatrical, something terrifying, a Halloween nightmare rendered in green and purple, with a leering mask that transformed his face into something inhuman. The glider followed, an Oscorp prototype modified for combat, capable of speeds and maneuvers that would leave conventional aircraft in the dust. Then the weapons, pumpkin bombs that could level buildings, razor-sharp bats that could slice through steel, gas grenades that induced hallucinations and hysteria. The Goblin did not simply want to commit crimes. The Goblin wanted to perform. Every theft was a spectacle, every murder was a message, and every encounter with Spider-Man was a test, a probe, a move in a chess game that only the Goblin truly understood. Peter Parker had faced villains before. He had traded blows with the Vulture and the Chameleon, had outsmarted the Tinkerer and outfought the Enforcers. But the Green Goblin was something different, something worse. A villain who seemed to anticipate his every move, who attacked with surgical precision, who appeared and vanished like smoke on the wind. Worse still, the Goblin was obsessed. Not with Spider-Man's destruction. Any common criminal could dream of killing a hero. The Goblin wanted more. He wanted to know who wore the mask. He wanted to understand what made Spider-Man tick, what he loved, what he feared, what would break him most completely. The Goblin studied his prey with the patience of a scientist and the hunger of a predator, cataloguing patterns, analysing behaviour, building a profile of the man behind the webs, and Spider-Man, lost in the chaos of his double life, did not see the trap closing around him. Harry Osborn became Peter's best friend almost by accident. They met at Empire State University, where Peter had enrolled after graduating from Midtown High, and discovered an unlikely kinship. Harry was everything Peter was not. Wealthy, popular, effortlessly charming. But he was also deeply wounded, desperate for connection, hungry for a friendship that expected nothing from him, except his company. Peter gave him that friendship freely. He did not know that every conversation, every shared meal, every late-night study session was being observed by eyes that glowed with malevolent intelligence. Norman Osborn, in his lucid moments, genuinely cared for his son's happiness. He approved of Peter Parker. He saw the boy's intelligence, his integrity, his positive influence on Harry's previously self-destructive behaviour. Norman the father wanted Peter in his son's life. But Norman the father was not always in control. The Goblin learned Peter's secret on a night that should have been unremarkable. A fight on a rooftop, webs and pumpkin bombs traded in the usual dance of violence. Peter was tired. Peter was careless. Peter allowed the Goblin to follow him farther than he should have, to observe him longer than was safe. The Goblin saw Spider-Man slip through a window in Queens. The Goblin saw Peter Parker emerge, and the Goblin smiled. Everything changed after that. The attacks became personal. The violence became intimate. Aunt May's home was vandalized. Peter's friends received threatening messages. The Goblin appeared at moments calculated for maximum psychological damage, after exams, during dates, in the quiet hours when Peter thought himself safe. "I know who you are," the Goblin whispered during one of their battles, his voice a sing-song mockery of sanity. "I know who you love. I know where they sleep." Peter fought back. Peter always fought back. But he was fighting an enemy who held all the cards, an enemy who could destroy him utterly without ever throwing another punch. The Goblin did not need to kill Spider-Man. He only needed to kill Peter Parker's life, one piece at a time, until nothing remained but despair. The tragedy was that Norman Osborn was still in there somewhere, still fighting for control, still horrified by the things his hands did when the other presence took the wheel. There were moments, rare, fleeting, heartbreaking moments, when Norman would surface, when he would look at the destruction around him with genuine confusion and genuine remorse. But those moments grew fewer as the Goblin grew stronger. The formula had not simply enhanced Norman's abilities, it had fractured his mind into territories, and the darkest territory was winning the war. Father and monster, genius and madman. Norman Osborn and the Green Goblin, sharing a body, fighting for dominance, united only in their fixation on the boy who swung through the night in red and blue. Peter watched his best friend's father across dinner tables and holiday gatherings, and sometimes he saw Norman looking back at him with an expression that made his spider sense scream. Sometimes he saw the other one instead, the one who wore Norman's face like a mask, the one who was already planning the next attack. This was not a rivalry. This was not a conflict between hero and villain, good and evil, law and chaos. This was a blood feud. A generational curse. A cycle of violence that would claim lives across decades, that would poison the Osborn family tree, that would haunt Peter Parker long after he had buried friends and lovers and versions of himself. The Green Goblin was Spider-Man's greatest enemy not because of his power or his intelligence or his arsenal of terrifying weapons. He was the greatest enemy because he was personal, because he cared, because in his twisted way, he understood Peter Parker better than Peter understood himself. And he would never, ever stop. Love was never supposed to be part of the equation. Peter Parker had accepted certain truths about his life. He would fight criminals. He would protect the innocent. He would carry the weight of his uncle's death until the day he joined him in the ground. But love, real love, the kind that cracked you open and remade you from the inside, that was a luxury he could not afford. Love meant vulnerability. Love meant hostages. Love meant giving his enemies exactly what they needed to destroy him. And then he met Gwen Stacy. Empire State University was supposed to be a fresh start. A place where Peter could shed the reputation that had followed him through high school, where his intelligence would be valued rather than mocked, where he might finally find people who understood him. He enrolled in the science program with modest hopes and lower expectations, prepared for more of the same isolation that had defined his adolescence. Gwen was in his biochemistry class. Blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold, blue eyes that sparkled with intelligence and mischief. A smile that made Peter's enhanced heartbeat stutter in ways that no amount of spider strength could control. She was brilliant, not merely smart, but genuinely brilliant. Capable of matching Peter equation for equation, theory for theory, insight for insight. She was also kind. In a world that had taught Peter to expect cruelty from beautiful people, Gwen Stacy was a revelation. She laughed at his jokes. She sought out his company. She looked at puny Parker and saw something worth knowing. Peter fell in love so fast he barely noticed it happening. Their courtship was sweet and awkward and achingly normal. Coffee dates between classes, study sessions that lasted until the library closed, long walks through campus where they talked about everything and nothing, discovering each other's minds with the hungry curiosity of young intellectuals finding their tribe. Gwen challenged Peter in ways no one ever had. She pushed back against his theories, demanded evidence for his claims, refused to be impressed by intelligence alone. She made him better. And for a brief, shining moment, Peter allowed himself to believe that he could have this, that he could be Spider-Man and Peter Parker, hero and boyfriend, protector of the city, and partner to the woman he loved. George Stacy knew the truth. Gwen's father was a captain in the New York Police Department, a decorated officer with decades of experience and an investigator's instinct for hidden things. He watched Peter with the careful attention of a man accustomed to reading lies, and somewhere along the way he put the pieces together. The late-night absences, the mysterious injuries, the way Peter's body language changed when danger was mentioned, subtle shifts that spoke of combat readiness rather than civilian fear. Captain Stacy never confronted Peter directly. Perhaps he was waiting for the right moment. Perhaps he understood that some secret served a purpose. But he approved of the relationship, welcomed Peter into his home, treated him like a son even as he must have known that this boy was the masked vigilante his colleagues cursed and his newspaper condemned. The approval was a gift. The knowledge was a burden. Captain Stacy died saving a child. It happened during a battle with Dr. Octopus, one of the endless conflicts that defined Spider-Man's existence. Falling debris, a sus little boy in the wrong place at the wrong time. George Stacy threw himself into the path of destruction without hesitation, protecting an innocent life at the cost of his own. Peter reached him in the aftermath, held his hand as the life drained away, and heard the dying man's final words, "Be good to her, be good to my daughter." He knew. Even at the end, even with his last breath, George Stacy was thinking of Gwen, trusting Spider-Man to protect what he could no longer protect himself. The weight of that trust settled onto Peter's shoulders like a second costume, invisible but impossible to remove. Gwen blamed Spider-Man for her father's death. She did not know that the man she blamed and the man she loved were the same person. She only knew that her father had died in a battle between costumed lunatics, that his life had been cut short by the violence that seemed to follow the web-slinger wherever he went. Her grief curdled into resentment. Her resentment poisoned something precious. Peter could not tell her the truth. Telling her meant endangering her further, painting an even larger target on her back than his love had already painted. So he absorbed her anger. He accepted her blame. He watched the woman he loved pull away from him, unable to explain why his absences were necessary, why his injuries were not mere accidents, why her father's final request had been made to him. It was into this fractured landscape that Mary Jane Watson arrived. "Face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot." Those were the first words she ever spoke to him, standing in the doorway of Aunt May's house, vibrant and electric and utterly unlike anyone Peter had ever met. Red hair cascading over her shoulders like a sunset, a smile that promised trouble and excitement and freedom from the weight that Peter carried everywhere he went. Mary Jane was a contradiction wrapped in confidence. She projected effortless cool, a party girl persona that seemed immune to the darkness that haunted Peter's world. She danced through life with apparent ease, collecting admirers and avoiding commitments, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. But Peter saw past the performance. Slowly, gradually, in glimpses and fragments, he discovered the walls that Mary Jane had built around herself. A neglectful father, a difficult childhood, a lifetime of learning that showing vulnerability meant inviting pain. The party girl mask was armor, no different from his own red and blue costume, a way of protecting the soft parts from a world that had proven itself unworthy of trust. Gwen was sincerity. Mary Jane was survival. Peter loved them both, differently, impossibly. Caught between the woman who knew his heart and the woman who understood his defences, he stumbled through a romantic maze of his own making. The triangle was never quite balanced. At any given moment, Peter was closer to one than the other, pulled by circumstance and chemistry and the relentless demands of his double life. Later there would be others, Felicia Hardy, the Black Cat, who loved Spider-Man but could never quite love Peter Parker. Betty Brant, the secretary who had been his first taste of adult attraction. A parade of connections, some deep, some fleeting, all shadowed by the same terrible truth. Everyone Peter Parker loved was in danger simply for loving him back. The mask created distance. The secret created walls. Every relationship was built on a foundation of necessary lies, and no matter how strong the connection, those lies eroded the structure from within. Peter could save the world 100 times over, but he could not save his own heart from the isolation that heroism demanded. Love was the price, love was always the price, and the bill was about to come due in ways that Peter could never have imagined. The bridge again, the fall again, the scream again. But now you know who is falling. Now you know who is screaming. Now you understand the weight of every second, the history behind every heartbeat, the love story that ends not with a wedding, but with a body growing cold in a hero's arms. Gwen Stacy is falling, and Spider-Man is about to fail. Norman Osborn's sanity had been eroding for months. The Goblin personality, once a visitor in his mind, had become the primary resident. Norman surfaced less and less frequently, confused and horrified by the gaps in his memory, by the green and purple costume he found hidden in his closet, by the newspaper headlines describing atrocities he could not remember committing. The final break came on an ordinary afternoon. Norman was in his office at Oscorp, reviewing quarterly reports, performing the rituals of corporate leadership that had once defined his existence. And then, without warning, the Goblin rose up from within, seized control with a violence that left Norman screaming silently in the prison of his own skull, and made a decision. It was time to end the game, it was time to destroy. Spider-Man completely, not his body, that would be too quick, too merciful. The Goblin wanted to destroy Peter Parker's soul. He wanted to leave the boy alive but empty, a hollow shell wandering through a world stripped of everyone he loved. He knew exactly how to do it. Gwen was alone when the Goblin found her. Peter was across town dealing with some minor emergency, trusting that the woman he loved would be safe in her own apartment. The spider sense could warn him of personal danger, but it could not warn him of danger to others. It could not tell him that green-gloved hands were even now reaching for the woman who held his heart. The Goblin did not hurt her, not at first. He simply smiled behind his grotesque mask and spoke in a voice that Gwen had heard across dinner tables, in her boyfriend's apartment, in all the ordinary spaces where Harry Osborn's father had seemed like nothing more than a successful businessman. "Your boyfriend has a secret," the Goblin said. "Shall I tell you what it is?" He told her everything, about Peter, about the spider bite, about the costume and the webs and the double life that had been hidden from her since the day they met. He told her about her father's death, about the real reason Captain Stacy had been in that alley, about the burden Peter carried knowing that his war had killed the man who trusted him, and then he took her. Peter received the message an hour later, a pumpkin bomb, delivered by an Oscorp courier with a note attached in the Goblin's manic scrawl, an address, a time, a promise. Come alone, or she dies screaming. He went. Of course he went. There was no calculation, no strategic consideration, no thought beyond the primal need to save Gwen from the monster who had taken her. Peter Parker had faced impossible odds before. He had fought villains who outmatched him in strength, in technology, in sheer malevolent creativity. But he had never fought with stakes like these. He had never fought for the woman he loved. The George Washington Bridge loomed against the night sky, its towers reaching toward clouds that threatened rain. The Goblin waited at the apex, his glider hovering in the darkness, Gwen Stacy unconscious in his arms. She looked small. She looked fragile. She looked exactly like what she was, a hostage, a weapon, a piece of leverage in a war she had never asked to join. "You came," the Goblin called out, his voice carrying across the wind. "I knew you would. Love makes us so predictable, doesn't it? So vulnerable, so wonderfully easy to destroy." Spiderman landed on a support cable, his body coiled with tension, his every sense screaming danger. The spider sense was a constant roar now, a warning that saturated his consciousness without pointing to any specific threat. Everything was dangerous. Everything was wrong. "Let her go, Norman. This is between us." The Goblin laughed, that terrible high-pitched cackle that haunted Peter's nightmares, the sound of sanity crumbling, of humanity drowning in madness. "Norman isn't here right now. Norman is sleeping. Norman is dreaming of boardrooms and balance sheets while I play with his toys." The Goblin stroked Gwen's hair with mock tenderness. "She's lovely, isn't she? I can see why you chose her. Such intelligence behind those eyes. Such spirit. It almost seems a shame. Don't." The word came out broken. Begging. Peter Parker, who had faced death 100 times without flinching, was begging now, because some things were worse than death, and watching Gwen die would be one of them. "Don't what? Don't do what I came here to do? Don't complete the game we've been playing since the beginning?" The Goblin's smile widened behind his mask. "You still don't understand, do you? I don't want to kill you, Peter. I want to hollow you out. I want to leave you alive but empty, a ghost wearing a costume, going through the motions of heroism while your heart rots inside your chest. And this?" He held Gwen up like a trophy. "This is how I do it," he dropped her. Time slowed. It always slows in moments like this, when the brain cannot accept what the eyes are seeing, when every millisecond becomes an eternity of desperate calculation. Peter saw Gwen's body tip forward, saw her fall away from the glider, saw her arms pinwheel as she plummeted toward the black water below. He was already moving, already diving, already firing his web shooter with the practiced precision of 1,000 rescues, 10,000 catches, a lifetime of threading needles in the space between disaster and salvation. The web caught her ankle. The line went taut. For one glorious instant, Peter believed he had done it, believed he had beaten the Goblin, believed that love and skill and sheer desperate will had triumphed over malevolence. Then he heard the sound. It was small, a crack, a snap, the sound of something giving way that should not give way, of a limit exceeded, of physics asserting itself with merciless precision. He did not understand at first. He hauled her up, pulled her into his arms, cradled her against his chest with all the gentleness his superhuman strength could manage. She was so light. She had always been so light. "Gwen, Gwen, it's okay. I've got you. I've got you now." But her eyes were open and empty. Her head lolled at an impossible angle. Her chest did not rise with breath. The web had stopped her fall. The sudden deceleration had snapped her neck. Spiderman had killed Gwen Stacy. The Goblin laughed. Somewhere above, circling on his glider like a vulture over carrion, Norman Osborn's ruined face laughed and laughed and laughed. The sound echoed off the bridge, off the water, off the walls of Peter's skull. It was the sound of victory, the sound of a game completed, the sound of a heart breaking in ways that would never fully heal. Peter lowered Gwen's body to the bridge with hands that shook despite their strength. He looked at her face one last time, the face he had, memorized, the face he had loved, the face that would never smile at him again, and then he looked up at the Goblin. Something fundamental shifted behind the mask. The quips died. The mercy evaporated. What rose in their place was older and darker, a rage that came from the same place as his grief, fed by the same source, burning with the same impossible intensity. Spider-Man did not speak. He simply launched himself at the Goblin with a speed and fury that the villain had never seen before. There was no strategy in the attack, no elegant web-slinging, no calculated strikes designed to incapacitate without killing. This was violence in its purest form. This was murder waiting to happen. Peter's fists connected again and again, driving the Goblin back, sending him crashing against the bridge's infrastructure, shattering the glider's controls. He did not stop, could not stop. Every punch was Gwen. Every impact was loss. The Goblin tried to fight back, tried to deploy his weapons, but Spider-Man was beyond reason, beyond fear, beyond anything resembling the hero who had always pulled his punches. "You killed her," Peter heard himself saying, his voice unrecognizable. "You killed her." The Goblin, bloody and broken, smiled through shattered teeth. "I told you," he rasped. "I told you I would hollow you out." Peter raised his fist for the killing blow. One more punch. That was all it would take. His enhanced strength could pulverize the Goblin's skull, could end this nightmare forever, could give him the only justice that seemed to matter anymore. But he hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, the Goblin activated his glider remotely. The damaged machine lurched forward, its razor-sharp front edge aimed directly at Spider-Man's back. The spider sense screamed. Peter twisted aside at the last possible instant. The glider impaled Norman Osborn instead. Peter watched his enemy die, watched the light fade from those mad eyes, watched the mask fall away to reveal the face of his best friend's father, broken and bloody and finally mercifully still. It was over. The Goblin was dead. Gwen was dead. And somewhere inside Peter Parker, the boy who had wanted nothing more than to prove himself worthy of love lay down in the ruins of his heart and did not get up. The funeral was held 3 days later. Rain, of course. There was always rain. Peter stood apart from the other mourners, separated by his secret, by his guilt, by the knowledge that he had caused this through the simple crime of loving someone in a world that punished love. Mary Jane found him afterward. She did not speak. She did not offer platitudes or explanations or any of the empty words that well-meaning people offer in the face of loss. She simply sat down beside him, took his hand in hers and waited. "Go ahead," she said finally, her voice soft. "Cry. I'm here," Peter cried. The night Gwen Stacy died changed everything. It ended the Silver Age of comics, the era of bright colours and easy victories and villains who always lost without consequence. It proved that heroes could fail, that love could be punished, that the universe did not care about costume or courage, or the desperate belief that doing right would lead to right outcomes. Spider-Man survived, Peter Parker survived, but they would never be the same. The Goblin was dead, but his legacy, his son Harry, his formula, his madness, would haunt Spider-Man for decades to come. And Gwen Stacy, the woman who deserved better than a hero's love, slept in the cold ground of a Queen's cemetery, her grave a monument to the price of power. With great power comes great responsibility. And sometimes responsibility is not enough. A hero is defined by his enemies. This is the unspoken law of mythology, the gravitational constant that shapes every legend worth telling. Perseus had Medusa, Hercules had the Hydra, Achilles had Hector, and Spider-Man, the wisecracking kid from Queens who had stumbled into power and tragedy, in equal measure, had the most magnificent collection of villains ever assembled in the history of comic books. They came in waves. They came relentlessly. They came with powers that should have destroyed him, and grudges that should have broken him, and obsessions that burned with the intensity of stars. Some were geniuses, some were monsters, some were both, and every single one of them contributed to the crucible that forged Spider-Man into something more than a hero. They made him a legend. Dr. Octopus was the first true nemesis. Otto Octavius had been a brilliant nuclear physicist, a man whose intellect rivaled the greatest minds of his generation. He had designed a set of mechanical tentacles, 4 articulated arms of titanium and steel, controlled by a neural interface of his own invention, to assist in handling radioactive materials at a distance. The tentacles were supposed to be tools, extensions of human capability, marvels of engineering that would revolutionize the field. Then the accident happened. A laboratory explosion bathed Octavius in radiation and fused the mechanical arms to his spine, grafting them permanently to his nervous system. The same radiation that bonded flesh to metal also damaged something crucial in Otto's brain, eroding the inhibitions and empathy that had kept his more destructive impulses in check. When he woke from his coma, Dr. Octopus was no longer a scientist. He was a supervillain. The tentacles gave him strength to rival Spider-Man. They moved with blinding speed, each arm capable of independent action, creating a whirlwind of steel that could attack from 4 directions simultaneously. But the tentacles were not what made Dr. Octopus dangerous. What made him dangerous was his mind, a mind that matched Peter Parker's intellect point for point, that could anticipate strategies and counter-tactics, that saw Spider-Man not merely as an obstacle but as a puzzle to be solved. Otto hated Spider-Man with a purity that bordered on the religious. The wall-crawler represented everything Octavius had lost: youth, agility, the adoration of the public, the chance to be seen as something other than a monster. Their battles were chess matches conducted in 3 dimensions, each combatant probing for weaknesses, each victory merely a prelude to the next engagement. But Dr. Octopus understood something that lesser villains did not. He understood that Spider-Man was too powerful to be defeated alone. He understood that the key to victory was not superior strength but superior numbers. He founded the Sinister Six. The recruitment was a masterwork of criminal diplomacy. Octavius reached out to Spider-Man's most dangerous enemies, appealing to their vanity, their greed, their wounded pride. One by one they answered the call. The Vulture came first. Adrian Toombs was an elderly engineer who had been cheated out of his life's work by a corrupt business partner, who had responded to injustice by building an electromagnetic harness that granted him the power of flight. Age had withered his body but sharpened his bitterness. He soared through the skies of New York like a bird of prey, robbing and killing with the cold efficiency of a man who had nothing left to lose. Elektra came next. Maxwell Dillon had been a lineman for the electric company, an ordinary man living an ordinary life, until a freak accident transformed him into a living battery. Lightning crackled in his veins, voltage arced from his fingertips. He could power a city or destroy one, and the intoxication of that power had corrupted whatever decency had once existed in his soul. Electro was unstable in every sense, emotionally volatile, prone to fits of rage, capable of tremendous destruction but incapable of controlling himself. Sandman was different. William Baker, who called himself Flint Marco after years of criminal aliases, had been a small-time crook, a petty thief running from yet another failed robbery when he stumbled onto a nuclear testing site. The radiation fused his body with the sand beneath his feet, transforming him into something no longer entirely human. He could shape his form into hammers and shields, could dissolve into grains and reconstitute at will, could become a giant or a whisper depending on his needs. But Sandman was never truly evil. He was desperate. He was angry. He had made terrible choices and paid terrible prices, and somewhere beneath the shifting granules of his existence, there still flickered the ember of the man he had been. Of all Spider-Man's enemies, Sandman would prove the most redeemable, a villain who wanted, more than anything, to stop being a villain. Mysterio brought theatricality to the gathering. Quentin Beck had been a special effects artist in Hollywood, a genius of illusion whose work had dazzled audiences, but whose ego had demanded more. He wanted recognition. He wanted fame. He wanted the world to acknowledge his brilliance, and when legitimate channels failed him, he turned to crime. Mysterio's powers were tricks, smoke and mirrors, holograms and hypnotic gas and elaborate stage magic scaled up to superhuman proportions. He had no genuine abilities, only the skill to make people believe he did. In many ways, he was Spider-Man's opposite, where Peter's powers were real but hidden. Mysterio's powers were fake but flaunted. Their battles were contests of perception, illusion against reality, lies against truth. Kraven the Hunter completed the original roster. Sergei Kravenov was Russian aristocracy, a man raised in privilege who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of the ultimate hunt. He had tracked and killed every dangerous animal on Earth. Lions, tigers, elephants, creatures that should have destroyed a mere human, but instead fell before his spears and his cunning. And then he heard about Spider-Man, a man who climbed walls, a man with the proportionate strength of a spider, a man who had defeated opponents. That should have been beyond any human capability. Kraven became obsessed. Spider-Man was the prey he had been searching for his entire life, the ultimate challenge, the final hunt, the trophy that would cement his legacy forever. The Sinister Six attacked Spider-Man in sequence, each member engaging the hero separately, each battle designed to weaken him for the next. It was a gauntlet, a crucible, a series of trials that should have destroyed anyone foolish enough to face them alone. Spider-Man faced them alone. He fought Electro in a power plant using insulated webbing to ground the villain's attacks. He fought Kraven in Central Park, turning the Hunter's own jungle tactics against him. He fought Mysterio in a funhouse of illusions, trusting his spider sense to pierce the deceptions. He fought Sandman on a construction site, using industrial vacuum equipment to scatter his granular form. He fought Vulture in the skies above Manhattan, outmaneuvering the older man through sheer agility. And finally, exhausted, bleeding, pushed beyond every limit he thought he had, he fought Dr. Octopus in a climactic battle that leveled half a city block. He won. Against all odds, against all reason, Spider-Man defeated the Sinister Six, but they would return. They always returned. The Sinister Six reformed under different leadership with different rosters, united by nothing more than their shared hatred of the web-slinger. Sometimes there were only 5, sometimes there were 12. The name became less important than the concept. Spider-Man's enemies, working together, pooling their resources and their rage. And there were others, so many others. The Lizard was perhaps the most tragic. Dr. Curtis Connors had been a friend, a brilliant scientist, a devoted family man, a colleague who had helped Peter with research and offered mentorship without asking anything in return. He had lost his arm in an accident and dedicated himself to regeneration research, studying reptiles that could regrow lost limbs, seeking the secret that would make him whole again. He found it. The serum worked. His arm grew back, but so did something else. The Lizard emerged from the ruins of Kurt Connor's humanity, a savage reptilian creature driven by predatory instinct, by cold-blooded hunger, by a brain that had devolved millions of years in a matter of moments. Peter fought his friend again and again, subduing the monster, restoring the man, knowing that the transformation would recur, that the Lizard was always waiting beneath Kurt's skin, that this cycle of horror and hope would never truly end. The Scorpion was created specifically to destroy Spider-Man. J. Jonah Jameson, in his infinite hatred, had funded an experiment to create a villain capable of defeating the Wallcrawler. McGargan was the subject, a private investigator of questionable ethics, who agreed to undergo a procedure that would grant him the proportionate abilities of a scorpion. The procedure worked. Gargan became stronger than Spider-Man, faster than Spider-Man, equipped with a tail that could shatter concrete. But the same process that enhanced his body also damaged his mind, leaving him violent and unstable, a weapon that Jameson could not control. The Scorpion became another monster in Spider-Man's gallery, a reminder that Jameson's crusade had consequences beyond headlines. The Rhino was simplicity incarnate. Alexei Sitsevich had been a poor immigrant, desperate for money, willing to undergo experimental treatments that bonded an indestructible suit to his skin. The suit made him impossibly strong, impossibly durable, a human tank who could charge through walls without slowing. But it also trapped him, fused permanently to his flesh, transforming him into something no longer entirely human. There was tragedy in the Rhino. Beneath the grey hide and the brutal strength, there was a man who had only wanted a better life, who had traded his humanity for power and discovered too late that the trade was permanent. The Hobgoblin emerged years later, a mystery wrapped in orange and blue. Someone had discovered Norman Osborn's old equipment, his gliders and pumpkin bombs and Goblin formula. Someone had taken up the mantle, improved upon it, become a new nightmare for Spider-Man to face. But who? The mystery of the Hobgoblin's identity consumed readers for years, spawning theories and debates that became legendary in comics fandom. Was it Ned Leeds, the Daily Bugle reporter, Roderick Kingsley, the fashion mogul, someone else entirely? The answer, when it finally came, was less important than the question. The reminder that evil could wear any face, that new goblins would always rise to replace the old. This was Spider-Man's burden. Not one enemy, but dozens. Not one battle, but an endless war. The Rogues Gallery kept growing, kept evolving, kept finding new ways to threaten everything Peter Parker held dear, and yet he kept fighting, because that was what heroes did. They faced impossible odds. They stood alone against armies. They lost battles and buried friends and suffered defeats that would have broken lesser souls. And then they got back up. Spider-Man's villains were not merely obstacles. They were mirrors. Each one reflected some aspect of Peter's own darkness. The rage he suppressed, the power he restrained, the isolation he endured. They showed him what he could become if he ever stopped choosing to be better. He looked into those mirrors every day, and every day he chose differently. The invitation came from beyond the stars. One moment Spider-Man was swinging through the concrete canyons of Manhattan, chasing a lead on a minor robbery, thinking about rent and web fluid and all the mundane concerns that filled the spaces between heroism. The next moment, reality itself tore open like wet paper, and Peter Parker found himself standing on an alien world, surrounded by the most powerful beings in the Marvel Universe. The Beyonder had summoned them. No one knew what the Beyonder truly was. A cosmic entity of incomprehensible power, a being so far beyond human understanding that even attempting to comprehend its nature was like an ant trying to understand calculus. It had observed the endless conflict between good and evil, heroes and villains, and it had grown curious. It wanted to see what would happen when the greatest champions and the most terrible monsters were gathered together and forced to fight. So it created Battleworld, a patchwork planet assembled from pieces of a dozen different realities. Battleworld was an arena on a cosmic scale. The Beyonder populated it with heroes, the Avengers, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man and villains, Dr. Doom, the Absorbing Man, Ultron, Galactus himself. Then it issued a simple command: slay your enemies, and all you desire shall be yours. The secret wars had begun. Spider-Man was out of his depth. He had fought street criminals, and supervillains had faced threats that would have destroyed ordinary men. But this was different. This was cosmic. The battles that raged across Battleworld involved power levels that made his spider strength seem laughable. Conflicts between gods and monsters, while he, a kid from Queens in a red and blue leotard, tried not to get stepped on. His costume was destroyed in the first major engagement, torn to shreds by forces beyond his ability to counter, leaving him fighting in scraps and tatters while beings of unimaginable might clashed around him. Peter needed a replacement. He needed protection. Another hero mentioned a machine he had found in one of Battleworld's alien structures, a device that could create fabric, generate material, produce anything the user required. Thor had used it to repair his cape. Others had used it to heal wounds and manufacture tools. Peter went looking for a solution to his wardrobe problem. He found something else entirely. The machine was in a dark chamber, humming with energy Peter could not identify. He approached it carefully, his spider sense oddly quiet despite the alien environment. When he activated the device, something emerged. Not fabric, not cloth, but a sphere of liquid darkness that rolled toward him with what seemed like purpose. Before Peter could react, the substance touched his hand. It flowed over him like water, like oil, like something alive and hungry that had been waiting for exactly this moment. It spread across his skin, up his arms, over his chest, covering his face in a mask of pure black. Peter struggled, panicked, tried to tear it away, and then, suddenly, the fear vanished. The substance was not attacking him. It was bonding with him, becoming him. And as it settled into place, Peter felt something he had never felt before. Completeness. The new costume was beautiful. Sleek black material that covered him from head to toe, broken only by a white spider symbol that spread across his chest like an embrace. There were no visible web shooters, but when Peter thought about webbing, it appeared from the backs of his hands, flowing organically, unlimited by cartridge capacity. The costume responded to his thoughts, shifting and morphing as he needed, creating pouches for his camera, extending to cover his civilian clothes, adapting to every situation with an intelligence that seemed almost prescient. It was perfect. It was everything Peter had ever wanted in a costume, and it was alive. Peter did not realize the truth for weeks. The Secret Wars ended, the heroes returned to Earth, and Spider-Man came home with his magnificent new suit, showing it off to anyone who would look. The costume performed flawlessly. It enhanced his abilities. It anticipated his needs. It was in every measurable way superior to his old red and blue design. But there were signs. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. Peter would wake exhausted, as if he had been active all night. His dreams became vivid and strange, filled with images of hunting, of pursuit, of dark hungers satisfied in the shadows. Sometimes he would find himself in locations he did not remember travelling to, dressed in the black costume, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. The costume was taking him out at night. While Peter slept, while his conscious mind rested, the alien garment was using his body for its own purposes, swinging through the city, responding to his suppressed desires, acting on impulses that Peter himself would never have indulged. He went to the Fantastic Four for help. Reed Richards, the smartest man in the world, examined the costume with the full resources of his laboratory. The tests were extensive, the results were disturbing. The black suit was not merely responsive material, it was a symbiote, a living extraterrestrial organism that bonded with hosts, feeding on their adrenaline, their emotions, their very life force. The symbiote was not malevolent exactly, it did not want to harm Peter. In its own alien way, it loved him. It wanted to be with him forever, to merge with him completely, to blur the line between host and costume until there was no Peter Parker and no symbiote. Only a single unified being wearing the face of Spider-Man. That was the horror of it. The symbiote's affection was absolute and suffocating. It would not let him go. Peter tried to remove the costume. He pulled at it, clawed at it, commanded it to release him. The symbiote refused. It clung tighter, sending tendrils deeper into his nervous system, fighting to maintain the bond it had formed. For the first time since he had put on the suit, Peter felt true fear, not of an external enemy, but of something wrapped around his own skin, something that had become part of him without his consent. Reed Richards had a theory. The symbiote was vulnerable to certain frequencies, intense sound, sonic vibrations that disrupted its cellular structure. If Peter could expose himself to enough sonic force, the symbiote might be shocked into releasing him. There was a church near the Baxter Building, a bell tower with massive bronze bells that had rung over the city for more than a century. Peter climbed to the top, the symbiote fighting him every step, trying to drag him back down, trying to reassert control. He reached the bells. He began to ring them. The sound was agony. It tore through the symbiote like fire, shredding its cohesion, disrupting the bond it had worked so hard to forge. The costume screamed, not a sound Peter could hear with his ears, but a psychic shriek of pain and betrayal that echoed through his mind. It felt like dying. It felt like murder. The symbiote released him. Peter collapsed in the bell tower, naked and shivering, watching as the black substance oozed away from his body, retreated into the shadows of the church, vanished into the darkness below. He had won. He was free. But the symbiote was not dead. It had absorbed enough of Peter's thoughts, enough of his emotions, enough of his very essence to survive. It knew his secrets. It knew his fears. It knew the face beneath the mask and the heart beneath the bravado. And it felt, in whatever way an alien organism could feel, utterly betrayed. Peter had rejected it. Peter had abandoned it. Peter had chosen agony over their union, had ripped them apart rather than accept the gift the symbiote had offered. The symbiote seethed in the darkness of the church. It nursed its wounds and its rage. It waited for a new host, someone who would appreciate what it had to offer, someone who hated Peter Parker as much as the symbiote now hated him. it would find one. Peter returned to his classic red and blue costume, grateful for the familiar feel of mundane fabric, grateful for the distance between his skin and the world. He tried to forget the black suit. He tried to convince himself that the nightmare was over, but somewhere in the city something black and bitter was learning to hate. And it would never, ever forgive. Eddie Brock had been a good man once. It seems important to say that. Important to acknowledge that the monster Venom would become was not born from nothing, was not some spontaneous eruption of evil into an indifferent universe. Eddie Brock had been a journalist, a husband, a man who believed in truth and justice and the power of the press to expose corruption wherever it hid. He had worked hard to build his career, climbing the ladder at the Daily Globe through talent and tenacity, earning a reputation as someone who would chase a story to the ends of the earth. The Sin Eater case was supposed to be his masterpiece. A serial killer was stalking New York, murdering those he deemed guilty of sin. The city lived in terror. The police were baffled, and Eddie Brock, through sources he trusted absolutely, identified the killer, a man named Emil Gregg, who had confessed everything in exclusive interviews, who had provided details that only the true Sin Eater could know. Eddie published. The Daily Globe ran the story on the front page. Eddie Brock's name was everywhere, attached to the biggest scoop of the decade. And then Spiderman caught the real Sin Eater. His name was Stanley Carter, a detective, a man whose connection to Emil Gregg was tangential at best. Gregg had been a compulsive confessor, a mentally ill man who claimed responsibility for crimes he had not committed, and Eddie had believed him. Every word of Eddie's reporting was wrong. Every detail was fabrication. The exclusive interviews, the insider knowledge, the career-defining scoop, all of it was built on the delusions of a man who wanted desperately to matter. The retraction destroyed Eddie. The Daily Globe fired him immediately. No other reputable outlet would touch him. His name had become synonymous with journalistic malpractice, a cautionary tale that professors would use in ethics classes for years to come. His wife, unable to bear the shame and the sudden poverty that followed, filed for divorce. His father, a cold and distant man who had never approved of Eddie's career choice, used the scandal as final proof that his son was a failure. Everything Eddie had built collapsed in a matter of weeks. His career, his marriage, his self-respect, his reason for living. And at the centre of that collapse, like a spider at the heart of a web of destruction, sat Spider-Man. Eddie's hatred grew in the darkness of his failure. It fed on his humiliation. It metastasized through every corner of his psyche until there was nothing left but the hatred itself, a pure and crystalline loathing that burned away everything else. He did not blame himself for trusting the wrong source. He did not blame Emil Gregg for lying. He did not blame the newspaper for publishing without adequate verification. He blamed Spider-Man. If the wall crawler had not interfered, if he had not caught the real Sin Eater, Eddie's story would have stood. The truth would never have emerged. Eddie would still have his job, his wife, his life. Spider-Man had taken everything from him, and Eddie would make him pay. But how? Eddie was just a man, a broken, unemployed, divorced man with nothing to his name but rage. Spider-Man was a superhuman, capable of feats that Eddie could never hope to match. The hatred burned, but it had no outlet, no path from fantasy to reality. Eddie began to exercise obsessively. He built his body into a weapon, spending hours in the gym, pushing himself past every limit. But even at peak physical condition, he knew it would never be enough. Spider-Man would swat him aside like an insect. The hatred would go unrequited. The revenge would remain forever out of reach. The despair grew alongside the hatred. They fed each other, intertwined, became indistinguishable. Eddie stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring whether he lived or died. He wandered the streets of New York like a ghost, invisible to the crowds that flowed around him, searching for something he could not name. He found himself at a church, Our Lady of Saints, a modest Catholic church in a neighbourhood that had seen better days. Eddie had been raised in the faith, though he had drifted from it in adulthood, too consumed by ambition to spare time for prayer. Now, at the nadir of his existence, he felt drawn back to the rituals of his childhood. Perhaps God could offer what the world had denied him. Perhaps there was mercy somewhere in the universe. Eddie knelt in a pew and prayed. He prayed for death. He prayed for release. He prayed for the hatred to stop, for the pain to end, for something, anything, to fill the emptiness that had consumed him. Tears streamed down his face. His hands shook. He was a man at the absolute end of his rope, reaching out to a god he was no longer sure existed. Something answered. It came from the shadows of the church, a darkness that moved with purpose, flowing down the walls like oil, drawn by the intensity of Eddie's emotions. It had been hiding here since its rejection, nursing its wounds, waiting for a host worthy of its power. It had felt Eddie's hatred, it had tasted his despair, and it recognized in him a kindred spirit. The symbiote touched Eddie Brock. The fusion was instantaneous and absolute. The symbiote poured into Eddie, filling every cell, every synapse, every corner of his being. It shared its memories, its time with Spider-Man, its love, its abandonment, its agony in the bell tower. Eddie shared his own memories, his career, his failure, his all-consuming hatred of the man who had destroyed him. They discovered they hated the same person. The symbiote knew everything about Spider-Man. It knew his powers, it knew his weaknesses, it knew his secret identity, his address, the names and faces of everyone he loved. And now Eddie knew too. The hatred they shared was no longer impotent. It had teeth. It had claws. It had the power to do what Eddie had dreamed of since the moment his world collapsed. They rose from the church floor as one being. They stretched their new form, marveling at the strength that flowed through their shared muscles. They looked at the world through eyes that saw beyond the visible spectrum. They smiled with a mouthful of fangs. "We," they said, speaking with a voice that was both Eddie and something else entirely, "are Venom." The first attack came without warning. Mary Jane was alone in the apartment she shared with Peter, enjoying a quiet evening, unaware that anything was wrong. The spider sense that had protected Peter for years did not trigger. The symbiote had bonded with him so completely that it had learned to mask its presence, to slip beneath the radar that had saved Spider-Man from countless threats. Venom materialized from the shadows like a nightmare given flesh. Mary Jane screamed. Venom did not attack. Not yet. He simply stood there, grinning that terrible grin, letting her see what her boyfriend's rejection had created. He spoke to her in Eddie's voice, explaining everything. The symbiote, the hatred, the coming reckoning. Then he vanished, leaving Mary Jane shaking, traumatized, marked forever by the knowledge that something monstrous knew exactly where she lived. Peter came home to find Mary Jane huddled in a corner, unable to speak, unable to do anything but point at the shadows. When she finally told him what had happened, Peter's blood ran cold. A villain who knew his identity, a villain immune to his spider sense, a villain born from his own discarded costume, empowered by his own rejection. He had created Venom. And now Venom was coming to destroy everything he loved. The battles that followed were unlike anything Spider-Man had faced. Venom was stronger than him. Venom was faster than him. Venom could appear anywhere, strike from any shadow, retreat into any darkness. The symbiote's hatred amplified Eddie's physical abilities, making him a perfect predator designed specifically to hunt Spider-Man. But the most terrifying thing about Venom was not his power, it was his perspective. In Eddie's mind, he was the hero. Spider-Man was the villain, a menace, just as J. Jonah Jameson had always claimed, a dangerous vigilante who destroyed innocent lives without consequence. Venom saw himself as an instrument of justice, punishing the guilty, protecting the innocent, doing what Spider-Man was too weak or too corrupt to do. He had a code. He would not harm those he deemed innocent, bystanders, children, the genuinely helpless. His violence was reserved for criminals, for threats, for Spider-Man and anyone who protected him. In his twisted way, Venom was more moral than many of the villains Peter had faced. He had lines he would not cross. But his definition of innocent was his own. His judgment was absolute, and anyone who got in his way was automatically guilty. Peter fought Venom again and again, winning narrow victories through cunning rather than strength. He exploited the symbiote's weaknesses, sonic attacks, intense heat, buying himself time, driving Venom back without ever truly defeating him. The symbiote always recovered. Eddie's hatred never faded. Years passed. The enmity evolved. Eddie Brock found other purposes, other missions. The symbiote bonded with other hosts, spawned other offspring, became something larger than its original vendetta. Venom transformed from pure villain to anti-hero, a lethal protector who fought criminals with methods Spider-Man would never condone. But the connection to Peter Parker never fully severed. The hatred cooled but never extinguished. Every time Spider-Man and Venom crossed paths, the old wounds reopened, the old grievances resurfaced. They were bound together, hero and monster, creator and creation. Spider-Man had rejected the symbiote because he feared what it was making him become. Venom was what it became without him. Some men are born broken. This is a difficult truth, one that society prefers not to acknowledge. We want to believe that monsters are made, that every villain has a tragic backstory, that understanding the wound explains the violence. We want to believe that with enough therapy, enough intervention, enough love, any soul can be redeemed. Cletus Kasady proved that belief wrong. He killed his grandmother when he was a child, pushed her down the stairs, watched her tumble, felt nothing but curiosity as the light left her eyes. He tortured his mother's dog, slowly, methodically, cataloguing its suffering with the detachment of a scientist conducting an experiment. He burned down the orphanage where he was sent after his parents died, an event that may or may not have been his doing as well, killing the administrator who had disciplined him for his behaviour. By the time Cletus reached adulthood, he had murdered 11 people. Those were just the ones the authorities knew about. The real number was almost certainly higher. He was not abused into becoming a monster. He was not traumatized into violence. Cletus Kasady was simply born without the capacity for empathy, without the neural architecture that allows human beings to recognize other human beings as real. To Cletus, the entire world was a stage populated by props, objects that screamed when broken, that bled when cut, that provided endless entertainment for a mind that craved chaos above all else. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms and sent to Ravencroft Institute for the criminally insane. The psychiatrist who examined him wrote extensive reports filled with clinical terminology: antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, profound moral deficiency. None of their labels captured the essential truth of what Cletus was. He was evil, pure and simple, evil without explanation, evil without excuse. His cellmate was Eddie Brock. The authorities thought they were being clever. 2 high-profile inmates, both requiring maximum security, both too dangerous to house with. The general population. Putting them together seemed efficient. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. Eddie still carried the symbiote within him. Or rather, the symbiote still carried a piece of itself within Eddie. The bond they shared was deeper than biology, a fusion of consciousness that could never be fully severed. And symbiotes, like all living things, reproduced. The offspring emerged while Eddie slept. A tendril of red, darker than blood, separating from the black mass of its parent and sliding across the cell floor toward the sleeping form of Cletus Kasady. Eddie did not notice. The parent symbiote did not care. Symbiotes felt no attachment to their spawn, no parental instinct, no desire to nurture or protect. Cletus woke with something inside him. The bonding was different this time. When the symbiote had joined with Eddie, it had merged with a broken man, a man consumed by hatred but still recognizably human. When it joined with Cletus, it found something else entirely, a void where conscience should be, an emptiness that the symbiote filled completely. Eddie Brock and his symbiote were 2 beings sharing one body, their personalities blending but still distinct. Cletus Kasady and his symbiote became one thing. There was no separation, no negotiation, no internal conflict between host and passenger. They were fused at the deepest level, their desires identical, their hungers synchronized. Carnage was born. The escape from Ravencroft was messy. Guards died, walls crumbled. The red symbiote flowed over Cletus like liquid murder, forming tendrils and blades and shapes that defied geometry. Carnage did not fight his way out so much as paint his way out, leaving a canvas of destruction that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. He vanished into the New York night, and then the killing began. Carnage did not steal. Carnage did not scheme. Carnage had no agenda, no master plan, no goal beyond the pure joy of destruction. He killed randomly, joyfully, with the enthusiasm of a child playing a favourite game. Homeless people in alleys, businessmen in parking garages, families in their homes, anyone, everyone. The only criterion was opportunity. Spider-Man responded to the first reports with the grim determination that had carried him through years of supervillain battles. But as the body count rose, as the crime scenes grew more horrific, Peter began to understand that this was something different. This was not a villain he could reason with. This was not an enemy he could defeat through cleverness or compassion. This was chaos incarnate. He went to Eddie Brock. It was perhaps the most difficult decision of Peter's career. Venom had tried to destroy him, had terrorized Mary Jane, had dedicated years to making Spider-Man's life a nightmare. But Venom had a code. Venom protected innocence. Venom, for all his monstrousness, drew lines that Carnage gleefully erased. The enemy of my enemy, Eddie, agreed to help. Not for Spider-Man, never for Spider-Man, but for the innocents dying in the streets, for the city that Venom had claimed as his own territory. Carnage was an abomination, a corruption of everything the symbiote represented. Eddie felt responsible in some twisted way. His symbiote had spawned this monster. His prison had housed this killer. Spider-Man and Venom, fighting side by side. The sight would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. Now it seemed necessary. Maximum carnage erupted across Manhattan. Cletus had gathered a family of his own, other broken souls drawn to his philosophy of chaos. Shriek, a woman with sonic powers and a mind shattered by abuse. Demogoblin, a demon wearing the mask of the Hobgoblin. Doppelganger, a mindless spider creature summoned from another dimension. Carrion, a viral entity obsessed with death. They called themselves the Carnage family, and they turned New York into a war zone. The battles were brutal, they were bloody. They pushed Spider-Man to limits he had never approached, forced him to accept allies he would never have chosen, made him question everything he believed about heroism and mercy. Carnage could not be reasoned with. Carnage could not be rehabilitated. Carnage could only be stopped again and again until the next time he escaped and the cycle began anew. The body count from Maximum Carnage was never officially released. Hundreds were injured. Dozens died. The psychological damage to the city was incalculable. New York had survived supervillains before, but it had never faced anything quite like the Carnage family's campaign of random terror. In the end, Spider-Man and Venom prevailed. They always prevailed. Carnage was captured, returned to Ravencroft, locked away behind walls that everyone knew would not hold forever. Because that was the terrible truth about Carnage. He would always return. The symbiote was nearly impossible to kill. Cletus Cassidy was utterly impossible to reform. Every containment was temporary. Every victory was a postponement. Spider-Man had faced many villains who wanted to rule the world, to steal fortunes, to prove their superiority. Carnage wanted nothing except to watch the world burn. There was no bargain to be struck, no compromise to be reached, no redemption arc waiting in some distant future. Some men were born broken, and some monsters could only be endured. The hunter had grown tired. Sergei Kravinoff stood before the mirror in his ancestral home, studying the face that stared back at him. The face of a man who had conquered every challenge the natural world could offer. Lions in the Serengeti, tigers in Bengal, polar bears in the Arctic wastes, elephants, rhinoceroses, crocodiles. Every dangerous creature on Earth had fallen before his spears, his traps, his bare hands. He had drunk the mystical herbs that enhanced his strength and speed beyond human limits. He had become the ultimate predator, and it meant nothing. The trophies that lined his walls mocked him with their glass eyes. The pelts and tusks and mounted heads were monuments to victories that no longer satisfied. Sergei had spent his entire life proving his superiority over the animal kingdom, and what had it earned him? Empty rooms, hollow accolades, a reputation that impressed no one who mattered. He was getting old. The herbs could slow the process, but they could not stop it. Soon his reflexes would dull. Soon his strength would fade. Soon Craven the Hunter would become Craven the Has-Been, a relic of an earlier age forgotten by a world that had moved on to newer sensations. But there was one prey he had never truly conquered. One quarry that had eluded him for years, that had escaped his traps and survived his ambushes, that had made him look foolish again and again in front of a watching world. Spider-Man! Sergei had fought the wall-crawler many times. He had come close to victory on more than one occasion. But close was not enough. Close was failure dressed in excuses. Every battle had ended the same way. Spider-Man swinging off into the night triumphant, while Kraven was left to lick his wounds and plan his next attempt. The obsession had consumed decades of his life. It had cost him relationships, opportunities, the chance to be something other than a man defined by his failures. And now, at the twilight of his existence, Sergei understood that he could not die without settling the account. He would defeat Spider-Man, truly defeat him. Not in combat, that had proven impossible, but in a deeper way, a final way. He would become Spider-Man. The plan unfolded with the patience of a master predator. Sergei watched. He waited. He studied his prey's patterns, his habits, his vulnerabilities. He prepared a special dart coated with a sedative powerful enough to drop an elephant, modified to account for Spider-Man's enhanced metabolism. When the moment came, Peter never saw it coming. The dart struck between his shoulder, blades during a routine patrol. Peter felt the sting, registered the wrongness, tried to turn and face his attacker, but his limbs were already failing him, his vision already darkening, his enhanced body succumbing to a poison designed specifically to overcome his resistance. He collapsed in an alley. The last thing he saw was Kraven's face looming above him, wearing an expression of terrible serenity. "Rest now," the hunter whispered. "Your part in this story is over." Kraven buried Spider-Man alive, a coffin in a forgotten cemetery, 6 feet beneath the earth, sealed with chains and locks that would have challenged Houdini. Kraven stood over the grave as the last shovel of dirt fell, and he felt something he had not felt in years: peace. Spider-Man was dead. Not literally. The sedative would keep him unconscious but alive, suspended in a death-like state for as long as Kraven required. But symbolically, spiritually, the wall-crawler had been defeated. Kraven had done what no other villain had managed. He had stopped Spider-Man. Now came the second phase. Kraven donned a black costume, a twisted version of Spider-Man's design, darker, more predatory, reflecting the soul of the man who wore it. He went out into the night, not as Kraven the Hunter, but as Spider-Man, the superior Spider-Man, the Spider-Man the city deserved. His methods were brutal. Where Peter would have webbed criminals and left them for the police, Kraven beat them into unconsciousness, broke bones, left lasting damage. Where Peter would have quipped and bantered, Kraven moved in silence, a shadow of death descending on the guilty. The criminals of New York began to whisper that something had changed, that Spider-Man had finally stopped holding back. For 2 weeks, Kraven lived Peter Parker's life. He patrolled Peter's routes. He fought Peter's enemies. He proved, night after night, that he could do everything Spider-Man could do and do it better. The ultimate test was Vermin, Edward. Whelan had been a geneticist before the experiments transformed him into something barely human. A cannibalistic creature with the features of a rat, driven by hunger and madness. Spider-Man had fought Vermin before and failed to capture him alone. The creature was too savage, too unpredictable, too willing to kill and devour anyone who got too close. Kraven hunted Vermin through the sewers of New York. The battle was vicious. It was primal. 2 predators, meeting in the darkness beneath the city, fighting with an intensity that transcended heroism or villainy. And when it was over, Kraven stood victorious, Vermin bound at his feet, the proof of his superiority complete. He had done what Spider-Man could not. He had become Spider-Man and exceeded him. The hunt was over. Beneath the cemetery, Peter Parker woke. The darkness was absolute. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of earth and decay. Peter's enhanced senses told him where he was before his conscious mind could accept it. Enclosed space, wood pressing against his face, weight above him, no light, no sound, no hope. He was buried alive. The panic came first, raw, animal terror that clawed at his sanity, that made him scream into the darkness until his throat was raw. He was going to die here. He was going to suffocate in this box, his body undiscovered, his loved ones never knowing what had happened to him. But Peter Parker had faced death before. He had lost his uncle, lost Gwen, lost pieces of himself that could never be recovered. He knew that panic was the enemy, that fear was the prison, that the only way out was through. He began to dig. His fingers tore at the coffin lid. His fists punched through rotting wood. Dirt poured in, filling his mouth, his nose, his eyes, and still he clawed upward, driven by something beyond strength, beyond will, beyond any physical capacity. He was Spider-Man. He had survived impossible odds 100 times. He would not die in a hole in the ground, beaten by a madman's obsession. His hand broke through the surface. Peter erupted from the grave like a resurrection, gasping, bleeding, covered in earth, more alive than he had ever been. The rain was falling. Of course it was falling. It always fell when the world changed. And Peter stood in the cemetery, letting the water wash away the dirt, the fear, the 2 weeks of darkness that had nearly claimed him. He went to find Craven. The confrontation was not what Peter expected. He arrived ready for battle, ready for the final showdown that years of enmity had been building toward. But Craven did not fight. Craven simply sat in his study, surrounded by his trophies, and smiled. "You came," the hunter said. "I knew you would." "Why?" Peter demanded. "Why all of this?" Craven's smile was sad, peaceful, the smile of a man who had finally found what he was looking for. "I had to know," he said. "I had to prove that I could be you, that I could do everything you do, and more, and I did. I defeated vermin. I was Spider-Man," he paused. "I was the better Spider-Man. So what now? We fight? You try to kill me again?" "No." Craven shook his head. "The hunt is over. I have nothing left to prove." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a rifle, an old hunting rifle, polished and gleaming. "You may go. You have won, Peter Parker. You have won simply by being who you are. I could wear your costume, but I could never be you. I could never carry the burden you carry, fight the fight you fight day after day with nothing but your conscience as reward." Peter took a step forward. "Sergei, go." Peter went. Behind him, in the empty house full of empty trophies, Craven the Hunter raised the rifle to his chin. The sound of the shot echoed through the mansion, through the rain, through the years that followed, years in which Peter would replay this night again and again, wondering if he could have done something differently, said something that would have changed the outcome. He could not have. That was the tragedy. Craven had made his choice long before Peter dug himself out of that grave. The hunt had always been leading here, to this final moment, to the only prey Craven had never been able to conquer. Himself. Peter stood in the rain outside Craven's mansion, listening to the silence that followed the gunshot. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a profound and terrible sadness for a man who had devoted his entire life to proving something that, in the end, had proven nothing at all. Craven's Last Hunt is considered one of the greatest Spider-Man stories ever written, not because of its action, though the action is superb, but because of its meditation on obsession, on masculinity, on the emptiness that waits at the end of every hunt. It asked questions that superhero comics rarely asked. What does victory mean when the war is inside you? What does strength mean when your greatest enemy is yourself? And what is left for a hunter who has finally caught his prey? The answer for Sergei Kravinoff was nothing. The answer for Peter Parker was everything that mattered. He went home to Mary Jane. He held her close, and he tried in the days and weeks that followed to forget the sound of that gunshot. He never did. The question haunted Peter Parker for years. Who am I? It seems like a simple question. The kind of thing a child might ask. The kind of thing philosophers debate in comfortable lecture halls. The kind of thing most people answer without thinking, and then move on with their lives. But for Peter Parker, the question became an existential nightmare, a fracture in the foundation of his identity that threatened to swallow everything he thought he knew about himself. It began with the Jackal. Miles Warren had been a professor at Empire State University, a brilliant geneticist who had taught Peter in his undergraduate years. He had also been secretly, obsessively in love with Gwen Stacy. When Gwen died on that bridge, when the Green Goblin stole her from a world that Miles believed did not deserve her, something broke inside the professor's mind. He blamed Spider-Man. Of course he blamed Spider-Man. Everyone blamed Spider-Man. It was practically a civic tradition in New York. But Miles Warren had the knowledge and the resources to do something about his blame. He had mastered the science of cloning, had pushed the boundaries of genetic duplication further than any researcher in history. And he had access to samples, cellular material from both Gwen Stacy and Peter Parker, collected during routine laboratory work, preserved in his private facilities. Miles Warren became the Jackal. He donned a green costume and a manic grin, embraced the theatrical villainy that seemed to infect everyone who put on a mask in this city. And he created clones, a clone of Gwen Stacy, perfect in every detail, carrying every memory up to the moment of her death, believing herself to be the original. The clone wandered through Peter's life like a ghost, a reminder of everything he had lost, a temptation and a torment wrapped in the face of the woman he had loved. A clone of Peter Parker, also perfect, also complete, also believing himself to be the original, carrying the same memories, the same powers, the same sense of responsibility that had defined Spider-Man since the death of Uncle Ben. The first clone saga, in the 1970s, ended with apparent simplicity. Peter fought his duplicate. The clone seemed to die. Peter disposed of the body and tried to move on, tried to convince himself that the nightmare was over, that he was real, that his identity was secure. He was wrong. The clone had survived. Badly injured but alive, he had crawled from the industrial smokestack where Peter had left him, had realized that he could not reclaim a life that belonged to another man, had chosen exile over confrontation. He wandered America for years, taking odd jobs, living under assumed names, trying to build something meaningful from the wreckage of his existence. He called himself Ben Reilly. Ben for Uncle Ben, the man whose death had shaped everything. Reilly for Aunt May's maiden name, a connection to the family he could never truly claim. Ben Reilly was, in every way that mattered, Peter Parker. He had the same powers, the same memories, the same values, the same humour, the same fundamental decency that made Spider-Man a hero rather than a menace. But he was also something else. A man without a past, a man without a place, a man who had to construct an identity from nothing because the identity he remembered belonged to someone else. He returned to New York in the 1990s, drawn back by news of Aunt May's failing health. He had stayed away for so long, had respected the boundaries of Peter's life, but some bonds were too strong to sever completely. May Parker had raised him, had raised the template from which he was copied, which amounted to the same thing. He could not let her die without seeing her one last time. Peter and Ben met. They fought, as superhuman men always seem to fight when circumstances threw them together. But they also talked. They recognized in each other something that no one else could understand. The weight of the spider, the burden of the gift, the loneliness of a life lived behind a mask. They became, against all odds, something like brothers. Then the Jackal returned with a revelation that shattered everything. According to Miles Warren's tests, according to evidence that seemed irrefutable, Ben Reilly was not the clone. Ben Reilly was the original Peter Parker, the true inheritor of the Spider's legacy, and the man who had been living Peter's life for the past 5 years, the man who had married Mary Jane Watson, the man who had mourned Gwen and fought the Goblin and carried the weight of great responsibility. That man was the copy. Peter Parker was the clone. The revelation landed like a bomb in the Spider-Man mythos. Readers who had followed Peter's journey for decades were told that their hero was a duplicate, a shadow, a mistake. The real Spider-Man was this newcomer, this wanderer, this Ben Reilly, who had appeared from nowhere to claim a legacy that fans had assumed was settled. The storyline stretched for years. It twisted and turned, revealing conspiracies within conspiracies, resurrections and deaths, and revelations that contradicted previous revelations. The Jackal had backup plans for his backup plans. Other clones emerged. Caney, a flawed duplicate driven mad by cellular degeneration, who became a tragic villain and eventually an anti-hero in his own right. Spidercide, a shape-shifting nightmare. Dozens of failed experiments, each one a reminder that identity was more fragile than anyone wanted to believe. Ben Reilly became the Scarlet Spider, then took over as Spider-Man when Peter decided to retire, to focus on his pregnant wife, to let someone else carry the burden for once. The transition was meant to be permanent. The future of the franchise was meant to belong to Ben. Fandom rebelled. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Readers did not want a new Spider-Man. They did not want to be told that the character they had loved for 30 years was somehow less real than this interloper. They did not want the complexity and the retcons and the endless uncertainty about who was original and who was copy. They wanted Peter Parker. Their Peter Parker. Editorial panicked. The storyline that had been planned to reshape Spider-Man for a new generation became a quagmire of desperate course corrections. Writers were brought in to fix what previous writers had broken. Revelations were revealed to be lies. Tests were proven to be falsified. Peter Parker was the original after all. He had always been the original. The entire clone conspiracy had been an elaborate deception, orchestrated by villains whose motivations grew more convoluted with every issue. Ben Reilly died. Impaled by the Green Goblin, Norman Osborn returned from his own apparent death, revealed to have been manipulating events from behind the scenes for years. As Ben's body crumbled to dust, the final proof of his clone nature, Peter held his brother's hand and wept for a man who had deserved better. The Clone Saga became a cautionary tale, a case study in editorial overreach, in storylines that spiraled beyond control, in the danger of messing with elements that readers held sacred. For years afterward, the very mention of clones in Spider-Man comics was treated as taboo, a wound too fresh to touch. But time has a way of rehabilitating even the most reviled stories. Ben Reilly returned, because no one in comics stays dead forever. He became the Scarlet Spider again, then Spider-Man again, cycling through heroism and villainy as different writers found different angles on his tortured existence. Caney, the failed clone, found redemption as a brutal but genuine hero carrying the Scarlet Spider mantle to Houston and proving that even a monster could choose to be something better. The clone conspiracy event years later saw the Jackal return with his most ambitious plan yet, cloning not just Peter, but everyone Peter had ever lost. Uncle Ben, Gwen Stacy, Captain Stacy, an army of resurrected loved ones offered as gifts, revealed as weapons. The questions the Clone Saga raised never fully went away. What makes a person real? Is identity a matter of biology or experience? If a copy has all your memories, all your values, all your love, is the copy any less you than you are? Peter Parker never found satisfying answers. Perhaps there were no satisfying answers to find, but he kept asking, he kept fighting, he kept being Spider-Man, whoever Spider-Man was, whatever Spider-Man meant. Some questions were more important than their answers. Some identities were defined not by their origins, but by their choices. And Peter Parker, clone or original, copy or template, was defined by a single choice he made every day, to use his power responsibly. That was enough. That had to be enough. Because in the end, the only person who could tell Peter Parker who he was Peter Parker himself. The explosion changed everything. Stamford, Connecticut. A quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where children played in front yards and neighbors knew each other's names. The New Warriors, a team of young superheroes with more enthusiasm than judgment, had tracked a group of supervillains to a house near an elementary school. They attacked with cameras rolling, filming for their reality television show, treating the confrontation like entertainment rather than war. Nitro was among the villains, a man who could transform his body into explosive energy, who could detonate himself with the force of a small nuclear device. When the New Warriors cornered him, when they pushed him past the point of desperation, he did what he had always done. He exploded. 600 people died. Most of them were children, caught in classrooms when the blast wave tore through the school. The footage played on every news channel, every website, every screen in America. The public had tolerated superheroes for years, had accepted the collateral damage as the price of protection. But this was different. This was too much. This was children burning because costumed adventurers wanted good television. The Superhuman Registration Act was introduced within weeks. The legislation was simple in principle, devastating in implication. Every person with superhuman abilities would be required to register with the federal government, to reveal their identity, to submit to training and oversight. Those who complied would become licensed agents of the state. Those who refused would become criminals. The superhero community fractured. Tony Stark, Iron Man, supported registration. He saw it as inevitable, as the only way to preserve any autonomy for enhanced individuals, before the government imposed something far worse. Captain America opposed it with equal conviction. He saw registration as a betrayal of everything heroes stood for, a surrender of liberty in the name of security. Lines were drawn. Friendships ended. The Marvel Universe went to war with itself, and Peter Parker, as always, found himself caught in the middle. Tony Stark had been mentoring Peter for months. The billionaire genius had taken the struggling photographer under his wing, had provided resources and guidance, had offered something Peter had lacked since Uncle Ben's death: a father figure. Tony gave Peter the Iron Spider suit, a technological marvel that enhanced his abilities and connected him to Stark's vast network of information. Tony gave Peter a place in the Avengers, a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. Tony asked Peter to unmask. The request came wrapped in logic and persuasion, in appeals to responsibility and the greater good. Registration was, coming whether Peter supported it or not. The choice was between controlled disclosure and inevitable exposure. If Peter revealed his identity voluntarily, on his own terms, he could frame the narrative. He could be an example. He could show the world that heroes had nothing to hide. Peter agonized. He consulted Mary Jane, who had the most to lose if his secret became public. He thought about Aunt May, about the targets that would appear on the backs of everyone he loved. He weighed decades of careful anonymity against the trust he had placed in Tony Stark. He made his choice. The press conference was held at the Stark Industries building. Cameras from every major network pointed at the podium where Spider-Man stood in his red and blue costume. The room was silent. The world was watching. Peter reached up and removed his mask. "My name is Peter Parker," he said, his voice steady despite the terror churning in his gut. "And I have been Spider-Man since I was 15 years old." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Front pages exploded with his face. Talk shows debated his history. J. Jonah Jameson, who had spent years crusading against Spider-Man, suffered what witnesses described as a complete breakdown upon learning that his most hated enemy had been working in his own building, had been selling him photographs of himself for years. For a brief moment, Peter felt relief. The secret was out. The weight he had carried since the spider bite was finally lifted. He could walk down the street with his face exposed, could introduce himself honestly, could stop lying to everyone he met. The relief did not last. The superhero community's civil war escalated. Captain America's resistance fought Tony Stark's registered heroes in battles that devastated city blocks. Friends who had stood together against cosmic threats now traded blows in the streets. The violence grew worse with every engagement, the stakes higher, the casualties mounting. Peter began to doubt. He saw what registration meant in practice. Heroes imprisoned without trial in the negative zone, a nightmare dimension that Tony had converted into a superpowered prison. He saw the lists being compiled, the surveillance being implemented, the machinery of control that registration had unleashed. He had supported transparency, but this was something else. This was oppression wearing the mask of safety. He switched sides. The defection was dangerous. Peter had been Tony's most visible convert, the proof that registration could work, the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man vouching for government oversight. His betrayal made him a target for both sides. The pro-registration forces who saw him as a traitor, the anti-registration resistance who were not sure they could trust him. But the consequences went far beyond politics. The Kingpin had been watching. Wilson Fisk, the massive crime lord who had ruled New York's underworld for decades, had noted Peter's unmasking with great interest. Spider-Man had been a thorn in his side for years. Now Spider-Man had a name, an address, a family. The sniper's bullet was meant for Peter. It hit Aunt May instead. Peter found her on the floor of their apartment, blood pooling beneath her fragile body, her life draining away from a wound that should have been his. The doctors gave her hours, then days. Then they simply shook their heads and said they were doing everything they could, which meant they were doing nothing at all. Peter Parker had unmasked to serve the greater good. He had trusted Tony Stark's vision of a regulated future. He had believed that transparency was worth the risk. And now his aunt was dying because a crime lord had access to information that should have remained secret. The guilt was crushing. Every moment at May's bedside was a reminder of his failure, of the choice that had led them here, of the arrogance that had made him think he could control the consequences of revelation. He had wanted to be an example. He He had become a cautionary tale. Peter tried everything: science, magic, deals with beings whose names he did not want to speak. Nothing worked. Aunt May continued to fade, her pulse growing weaker, her breaths growing shallower, the woman who had raised him slipping away one heartbeat at a time. He was desperate, he was broken, he was willing to do anything, pay any price, make any sacrifice to undo what he had done. And in his darkest moments something heard him. Something answered. Something offered a deal. The devil came dressed in red. Peter had exhausted every option. Every scientist who owed him favours. Every sorcerer who might bend the rules of reality. Every cosmic entity who had ever shown him the slightest kindness. He had begged and bargained and debased himself before powers that should have terrified him, and none of it had mattered. Aunt May lay in a hospital bed, machines breathing for her, monitors tracking the slow decline of her vital signs, and there was nothing that Peter Parker could do to save her. He had faced Galactus. He had survived the Beyonders games. He had clawed his way out of a grave after Kraven buried him alive. But this enemy could not be punched or webbed or outsmarted. This enemy was simply time, simply biology, simply the bullet that had torn through May Parker's body because her nephew had been foolish enough to show his face to the world. Mephisto found him in the hospital chapel. The demon lord of Marvel's hell did not arrive with flames and brimstone. He materialized in the pew beside Peter, wearing a tailored suit and an expression of almost paternal concern. His eyes glowed faintly red in the dim light, but otherwise he might have been any wealthy businessman offering condolences to a grieving family member. "Such pain," Mephisto said, his voice smooth as silk over broken glass. "Such unnecessary pain. It breaks my heart to see it." Peter should have attacked, should have fled, should have done anything except sit there, listening as the devil whispered in his ear. But he was empty, hollowed out by grief and guilt and the crushing weight of his own failure. He had no fight left. "What do you want?" Peter asked. Mephisto smiled. "The question, Peter Parker, is what do you want? I can save her. I can reach into that broken body and pull her back from the edge. I can give you your aunt, whole and healthy, with decades of life still ahead of her. In exchange for my soul. Please," Mephisto waved a dismissive hand. "Your soul is spoken for. The light in you burns too bright for my kingdom. No, I want something far more precious. Something that will cost you nothing and everything all at once." He leaned closer, and Peter smelled something ancient beneath the cologne. Something that had watched civilizations rise and fall. "I want your marriage." Peter did not understand at first. The words made no sense, arranged in an order that his exhausted mind could not pass. His marriage? What did that have to do with Aunt May, with the bullet, with any of the desperate circumstances that had led him to this chapel? Mephisto explained. He wanted Peter and Mary Jane's love. Not the emotion itself, but the history of it. The wedding, the years of partnership, the bond they had built through triumph and tragedy. He would reach back through time and unravel it, rewrite reality so that the marriage had never happened, so that Peter and Mary Jane had remained friends rather than spouses. In exchange, Aunt May would live. The world would forget that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. Everything would reset to something simpler, something safer, something that looked like the life Peter had lived before Civil War tore it apart. "Why?" Peter demanded. "Why would you want that? What possible value does our marriage have to someone like you?" Mephisto's smile widened. "Because it is pure, because it is rare, because in all the cosmos there are few things as precious as a love freely given and faithfully maintained. Your marriage is a light in the darkness, Peter Parker, and I am a collector of extinguished lights." Peter should have refused. Every instinct screamed at him to reject the offer, to accept May's death rather than bargain with a demon. Uncle Ben had taught him that some prices were too high. Great power demanded great responsibility, and surely responsibility meant refusing to let evil profit from your desperation. But Aunt May was dying. The woman who had raised him, who had sacrificed everything for him, who had loved him unconditionally through every failure and every triumph. She was dying because of his choices, because he had unmasked, because he had trusted Tony Stark, because he had been arrogant enough to think he could control the consequences of his actions. How could he let her pay for his mistakes? Mary Jane found him still sitting in the chapel, staring at nothing, wrestling with a choice that had no right answer. Peter told her everything. The offer, the price, the impossible mathematics of trading their past for May's future. She should have been furious. She should have demanded that Peter reject the deal, that he choose their love over his aunt's life. Any reasonable person would have fought for their marriage, for the years they had built together, for the future they had planned. Mary Jane Watson was not any reasonable person. She understood what May meant to Peter. She understood the guilt that was eating him alive, the knowledge that his aunt was dying for his sins, and she understood, in a way that Peter himself could not articulate, that letting May die would destroy him more thoroughly than any devil's bargain ever could. They made the choice together. Holding hands in that hospital chapel, with the monitors beeping their slow countdown in the room down the hall, Peter and Mary Jane agreed to Mephisto's terms. The demon smiled, reality shimmered, and everything changed. Peter Parker woke in his apartment, alone. There were no wedding photographs on the walls, no second toothbrush in the bathroom, no memories of vows exchanged, of anniversaries celebrated, of the 1,000 small intimacies that define a marriage. Mary Jane was his friend, his ex-girlfriend, someone he cared about deeply, but not his wife. Never his wife. Aunt May was healthy. The world had forgotten that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. The nightmare of civil war had been undone, its consequences erased along with the marriage that had been sacrificed to pay for the reset. The deal was complete, the devil was satisfied, and Peter Parker, standing in his empty apartment, felt the absence of something he could no longer remember having. A phantom limb where his marriage used to be. A hollow space in his heart that would ache for years without ever understanding why. The fans were outraged. One More Day became one of the most controversial stories in Spider-Man history, condemned by readers who felt that decades of character development had been erased for editorial convenience. The marriage had represented growth, maturity, the idea that heroes could have lasting relationships that enriched rather than limited their stories. Now it was gone, traded to a demon, written out of existence by writers who wanted a younger single Spider-Man unburdened by the complications of married life. Peter never knew what he had lost. That was part of the bargain. The memories were taken along with the marriage, leaving only a vague sense of wrongness that he could never quite explain. But somewhere, in whatever realm Mephisto called home, a devil savoured the taste of extinguished light. And Spider-Man swung through a city that had forgotten his face, alone again, starting over, carrying a weight he could not name. Otto Octavius was dying. The body that had carried him through decades of villainy was finally failing. Too many battles, too many defeats, too many times his flesh had been broken and rebuilt, each recovery leaving him weaker than before. His organs were shutting down one by one, his nervous system degrading, his brilliant mind trapped in a prison of failing meat that could no longer sustain it. Dr. Octopus had always feared death, not the abstract concept. He had faced mortality countless times in his wars against Spider-Man, but the specific personal reality of his own ending. The idea that Otto Octavius, genius among geniuses, would simply cease to exist while lesser minds continued to waste oxygen was intolerable, unacceptable, an injustice that demanded correction. He had one final plan. The technology had taken years to develop, hidden projects conducted in secret laboratories, while his public battles with Spider-Man continued their familiar patterns. A device capable of transferring consciousness between bodies. A way to escape his dying flesh and claim a new vessel. All he needed was a suitable host. He chose Spider-Man. The switch happened faster than Peter could. Process. One moment he was fighting Dr. Octopus in what seemed like a routine confrontation. The next moment he was looking at his own body from the outside, trapped in Otto's withered form, watching his enemy walk away wearing his face. Peter tried to fight. Of course he tried. He was Spider-Man. He always fought. But Otto's body was failing too rapidly. The damage too severe. Peter Parker died in a hospital bed, surrounded by villains who thought they were mourning their leader, calling out warnings that no one understood. Dr. Octopus had won. Completely. Absolutely. The greatest victory any Spider-Man villain had ever achieved. But something unexpected happened in the moment of Peter's death. The Mind Swap had created a link between them, a bridge of shared consciousness that Otto had not anticipated. As Peter died, his memories flooded into Otto's stolen brain. Not just information, but experience, emotion, the full weight of what it meant to be Peter Parker. Otto felt Uncle Ben's death, felt the guilt that had shaped Spider-Man's entire existence, felt the love for Aunt May, for Mary Jane, for every innocent person Peter had ever saved. He experienced, in a single overwhelming instant, the soul of the man he had murdered. And Otto Octavius, for the first time in his life, understood what responsibility meant. He made a vow over Peter's grave, not to abandon the Spider-Man identity, that would waste the perfect body he had claimed, but to honor it, to prove that he could be better than Peter Parker had ever been, to become not just Spider-Man, but the superior Spider-Man. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Otto approached heroism the way he approached everything, with ruthless efficiency and absolute conviction. Where Peter had pulled his punches, Otto struck to disable permanently. Where Peter had let criminals escape to fight another day, Otto tracked them to their homes and ended their careers with brutal finality. Where Peter had balanced heroism with a personal life, Otto subordinated everything to the mission. The results were undeniable. Crime rates plummeted. Villains who had treated Spider-Man as a revolving door suddenly found themselves facing an enemy who did not believe in second chances. The Vulture lost an eye. Scorpion lost his jaw. Massacre, a mass murderer who had escaped justice repeatedly, lost his life, executed by a Spider-Man who had decided that some threats were too dangerous to leave breathing. The city noticed. The other heroes noticed. Something was different about Spider-Man. Something harder and colder. Something that made even his allies uneasy. But Otto was not merely fighting crime. He was building an empire. He enrolled in doctoral programs that Peter had never completed, earning advanced degrees through a combination of genuine brilliance and Otto's complete disregard for work-life balance. He founded Parker Industries, transforming Peter's perpetual financial struggles into a technology company that rivaled Stark Industries. He created an army of spider robots to patrol the city, extending his surveillance across every block and alley. He fell in love. Anna Maria Marconi was a fellow graduate student, a woman of fierce intelligence and genuine warmth who saw past Otto's arrogance to something softer beneath. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, built on mutual respect and shared passion for discovery. Otto found himself experiencing emotions he had long dismissed as weakness, tenderness, vulnerability, the desire to be known by another person. For perhaps the first time in his existence, Otto Octavius was happy. But Peter Parker was not entirely gone. A fragment of Peter's consciousness had survived the transfer, a ghost in the machine of Otto's stolen brain. This remnant Peter watched helplessly as Otto lived his life, made decisions with his body, built relationships with his friends and family. He fought to reassert himself, to reclaim what had been taken. But Otto's will was too strong, his control too complete. The ghost could only watch and wait. The Goblin Nation changed everything. Norman Osborn had returned. Norman always returned, and he had spent months building an army in the shadows while Otto's Spider-Bots watched the streets above. The Green Goblin had identified the gaps in Otto's surveillance, had recruited an army of criminals and outcasts, had prepared a campaign of destruction that would make his previous crimes look like pranks. When the Goblin Nation rose, it rose everywhere at once. Explosions across Manhattan, coordinated attacks on police stations, hospitals, infrastructure. An army of goblin-masked soldiers pouring through the streets while Otto's carefully constructed systems failed to respond. Otto fought. He fought with everything he had, with all the enhanced abilities and technological resources at his disposal, but the Goblin had planned for the superior Spider-Man, had studied his patterns, had designed an assault specifically calculated to exploit his weaknesses, and Otto's greatest weakness was his pride. He had believed himself superior, had believed that his intelligence and ruthlessness made him better than Peter Parker in every way. But facing the Goblin's onslaught, watching his empire crumble, seeing Anna Maria captured by enemies he could not defeat, Otto was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. He was not enough. Peter Parker had faced the Green Goblin countless times, had lost Gwen Stacy, had nearly lost his sanity, had endured decades of Norman Osborn's obsessive hatred. And Peter had survived not because he was smarter or stronger or more ruthless, but because he never gave up. Because he understood that heroism was not about superiority, it was about sacrifice. Otto made one final choice. In the depths of his mind, he found the fragment of Peter that still lingered, the ghost he had suppressed, the consciousness he had tried to erase, and Otto Octavius, the superior Spider-Man, the man who had stolen Peter Parker's life and lived it better than Peter ever had, made the most difficult decision of his existence. He let go. "You are the superior Spider-Man," Otto whispered, as he began the process of deleting his own consciousness, of surrendering the body he had claimed to its rightful owner. "You always were." Peter Parker returned. He woke in his own body, surrounded by chaos, facing an enemy he had fought before. The Goblin Nation raged around him. Anna Maria was still in danger. The city was burning. But Spider-Man was back. The real Spider-Man. The one who had learned that great power demanded great responsibility, who had failed and fallen and gotten back up more times than he could count, who understood that heroism was not about being superior to others, but about being better than your own worst impulses. Otto Octavius had tried to be a hero. In the end, he had succeeded, not by proving himself superior, but by recognizing that some battles required a different kind of strength. Peter swung into the flames to save the city Otto had tried to protect, and somewhere, in whatever afterlife awaited men who had been both villain and hero, Otto Octavius finally rested. The web extends forever. This is the truth that Peter Parker never fully grasped during his years as the sole Spider-Man, swinging through the canyons of Manhattan, believing himself unique in his burden and his blessing. He thought he was alone. He thought the spider had chosen him and only him, that the weight of great responsibility rested on his shoulders and no others. He was wrong. Across the infinite expanse of the multiverse, in realities stacked upon realities like pages in an endless book, the spider had bitten again and again. Different people, different circumstances, different faces beneath masks that all carried the same essential meaning. Every universe, it seemed, needed a spider. Every reality produced its own champion, its own wall crawler, its own hero who learned through tragedy that power demanded sacrifice. The web of life and destiny connected them all, a mystical construct that existed outside normal space and time, binding every spider-person across every dimension into a single tapestry of fate. Most of them never knew it existed. Most of them lived and fought and died believing themselves singular, never suspecting that countless versions of themselves were doing the same thing in countless parallel worlds. But the web was real, and eventually something came hunting along its strands. Miles Morales was 13 years old when his universe changed. He lived in Brooklyn, in a reality designated Earth 1610, where the details differed but the broad strokes remained familiar. There was a Spider-Man in this world too, a Peter Parker who had carried the mantle for years, who had become a beloved figure in New York, who had inspired a generation of young people to believe that heroes could come from anywhere. Miles was one of those young people, a kid from a mixed heritage family, his father African American, his mother Puerto Rican, growing up in a city that demanded he navigate multiple worlds before he was old enough to drive. He was smart, he was talented, he had won a lottery to attend a prestigious boarding school, a ticket out of his neighborhood that felt as much like exile as opportunity. He was visiting his Uncle Aaron when the spider bit him. Aaron Davis was a complicated man. Miles loved him. Uncle Aaron was cool in ways that Miles's police officer father could never be. Relaxed and funny, and willing to treat Miles like an adult. But Aaron had secrets. Aaron had connections to the criminal underworld that Miles did not understand, that operated in shadows Miles had never explored. The spider had escaped from one of those shadows, a specimen from Oscorp, genetically modified and irradiated, carrying the same potential that had transformed Peter Parker years before. It found Miles in his uncle's apartment. It bit him on the hand, and Miles Morales became something impossible. The powers manifested chaotically, wall crawling that activated without warning, leaving Miles stuck to his desk at school, to the ceiling of his dorm room, to every surface his panicking hands touched. Enhanced strength that made him afraid to hug his mother, a tingling danger sense that screamed at threats he could not identify, and something else something Peter Parker had never possessed. Miles could turn invisible. He could discharge bioelectric venom through his touch, stunning enemies with a power that crackled blue across his skin. The spider had given him the same gifts it had given Peter, but it had added new ones, mutations specific to Miles, abilities that would define his unique place in the spider legacy. He did not want to be a hero, not at first. He was a kid, overwhelmed by changes he did not understand, terrified of a responsibility he had never asked for. He wanted to go back to worrying about grades and girls and the ordinary anxieties of adolescent existence. Then Peter Parker died. The Green Goblin killed him. In Miles's universe, the final battle between Spider-Man and his greatest enemy ended differently than it had in Peter's original timeline. Norman Osborn won, Peter Parker fell, and New York was left without a Spider-Man, without the hero who had protected it for so long, without anyone to stand between the innocent and the darkness. Miles watched it happen. Not the death itself, but the aftermath. The news coverage, the mourning, the void that Peter's absence left in the city's soul. He felt the weight of the powers he'd been given, the gifts that matched the dead hero's abilities, the potential that burned in his veins without purpose. He could walk away. No one knew what he was. No one expected anything from him. He could let the spider powers fade unused, could live a normal life, could leave heroism to others better suited for the burden. But Miles Morales had learned the same lesson Peter Parker had learned, even if he had learned it differently. He had seen what happened when power went unused, when capable people stood aside, when the world cried out for help and no one answered. He put on the mask. The new Spider-Man was younger, less experienced, prone to mistakes that Peter would never have made, stumbling through heroism with the awkward grace of a teenager learning to walk in a body that no longer obeyed normal rules. But he was also brave, also kind, also determined to honour the legacy he had inherited, to prove that the spider had chosen wisely when it bit a kid from Brooklyn who had never asked to be special. Miles was not a replacement for Peter Parker. He was a continuation, a new chapter in a story that had no ending, a fresh voice carrying forward themes that had resonated for generations. He was proof that Spider-Man was not a single person but an idea, and ideas could be inherited. Across the multiverse, other spiders were discovering the same truth. Gwen Stacy lived on Earth 65, in a reality where the spider had bitten her instead of Peter Parker. She became Spider-Woman, then Ghost Spider, a hero who carried her own version of the familiar tragedy. In her world, Peter Parker had not become Spider-Man. Peter Parker had become the Lizard, transformed by his own desperation into a monster that Gwen was forced to fight. He died in her arms, and she carried the guilt of that death the same way her counterpart carried the guilt of hers. The mirror was perfect and terrible. Peter mourning Gwen across infinite realities. Gwen mourning Peter in at least one. The spider's gift always came with the spider's price. Spider-Man Noir swung through a world of shadows and fedoras, a 1930s New York where the Depression had never ended, and justice was dealt in back alleys by a Peter Parker who had learned his ethics from a murdered uncle and his methods from a world without mercy. Spider-Ham, Peter Parker, existed in a cartoon reality where animals walked upright, and physics obeyed the rules of animation, a ridiculous concept that somehow contained the same heart as every other spider story. Miguel O'Hara was Spider-Man in the year 2099, a geneticist whose corporate espionage had resulted in powers that made him the hero of a cyberpunk future. There were thousands of them, millions, every variation imaginable and many that were not. Some were heroes, some were villains, some existed in realities so strange that the concept of heroism had no meaning. But all of them were connected by the web, bound by threads of destiny that transcended individual existence. The inheritors discovered the web and saw it as a hunting ground. They were ancient beings, a family of immortal predators who fed on the life force of totemic avatars, beings who embodied the essence of animals. Spiders were their favourite prey. The inheritors had hunted spider people across the multiverse for millennia, consuming their essence, growing stronger with each kill. Morlun was the most relentless. He had faced Peter Parker before, had nearly killed him, had demonstrated that Spider-Man's greatest enemies were not confined to a single reality. Now, Morlun and his family launched a coordinated assault on every spider person in existence. a genocide across infinite dimensions. The Spider-Verse event united them. For the first time, spider people from countless realities gathered together, an army of wall crawlers standing against extinction. They fought. They died. They discovered reserves of courage they had never known they possessed. And they won. Together. The animated film captured something essential about what this meant. When Miles Morales took his leap of faith, falling upward through the New York skyline, trusting himself for the first time since the spider had changed his life, he embodied a message that transcended any single story. Anyone can wear the mask. It does not matter where you come from. It does not matter what you look like, what language your parents speak, what neighborhood raised you. The spider does not discriminate. The web welcomes all who are willing to bear its weight. Peter Parker was the first. He will always be the first, the template, the soul of Spider-Man. His tragedy, his humor, his relentless determination to do good in a world that punishes goodness. These are the elements that every spider carries forward. But he is not the only one, not anymore. The web extends forever, and along its strands swing heroes beyond counting. Some wear red and blue. Some wear black. Some are young and learning. Some are old and tired. All of them carry the same essential truth in their hearts, the same lesson that Uncle Ben taught in a modest house in Queens, generations ago. With great power comes great responsibility. This is the story of Spider-Man, not one man, but many, not one universe, but all of them. A legacy written in webs and blood and sacrifice, in jokes told to mask fear, in masks worn to protect love. Wherever there is a spider, there will be a Spider-Man. Wherever there is power, there will be someone who understands what power demands. Wherever there is a kid from nowhere who suddenly has the ability to change everything, there will be a choice. And the choice, always, is to be a hero. That is the web. That is the legacy. That is Spider-Man. Forever. Section 20. The Heart of the Spider. Why him? Of all the heroes who have worn capes and masks, who have soared through skies and saved worlds, who have become legends etched into the bedrock of popular culture, why does Spider-Man endure? Why does a teenager from Queens, bitten by a radioactive spider in 1962, remain the most beloved superhero on Earth more than 6 decades later? The answer is not his powers. His powers are impressive, but his. Hardly unique. Dozens of heroes can lift cars, can dodge bullets, can perform feats that defy physics. The Marvel Universe alone contains gods and mutants and cosmic entities capable of reshaping reality with a thought. Compared to Thor or the Hulk or the Silver Surfer, Spider-Man is practically ordinary. The answer is not his villains, though his rogues gallery is among the finest ever assembled. The Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus and Venom are magnificent creations, but Batman has the Joker, Superman has Lex Luthor, the X-Men have Magneto. Great enemies do not, by themselves, explain great heroes. The answer is not even his costume, though the red and blue has become one of the most recognizable images in human history. Iconography matters, but iconography fades. What remains is something deeper, something that cannot be captured in merchandise or movie posters, or the endless parade of adaptations that have brought Spider-Man to every screen imaginable. The answer is Peter Parker. Not Spider-Man, Peter Parker, the boy beneath the mask, the human being who struggles to pay rent, who disappoints the people he loves, who arrives late to everything because his responsibilities pull him in more directions than any one person can manage. The guy who gets fired from jobs and fails classes and watches relationships crumble because he cannot explain why he keeps disappearing at crucial moments. Peter Parker is us. That is the secret. That is the magic. That is why a character created to sell comic books to teenagers became a global phenomenon that transcends age and culture and generation. Peter Parker is the first superhero who felt like a real person, whose problems did not evaporate when he put on the costume, whose life actually got harder because of his powers rather than easier. Superman is an ideal, Batman is a fantasy, Captain America is an aspiration, but Spider-Man is a mirror. When we look at Peter Parker, we see ourselves reflected back, our failures, our frustrations, our desperate attempts to do right in a world that does not reward righteousness. We see someone who is trying, constantly trying, and often falling short despite his best efforts. And we see someone who keeps trying anyway. That is what makes Spider-Man special, not the wall crawling or the web slinging or the proportionate strength of a spider. What makes him special is the getting back up, the refusal to stay down no matter how many times life knocks him flat, the choice, made again and again, to be good even when goodness costs everything. Peter Parker has lost more than almost any hero in comics. He lost his parents before he could know them. He lost Uncle Ben because of his own selfishness. He lost Gwen Stacy because a madman wanted to hurt him. He lost his marriage to a devil's bargain. He has been beaten, buried, broken, betrayed by friends and tormented by enemies and abandoned by a public that cannot decide whether to worship him or condemn him. Any one of those losses could justify giving up. Any one of those tragedies could excuse walking away, hanging up the costume, letting someone else carry the burden. The universe has given Peter Parker every reason to stop being Spider-Man. He never stops. That persistence is not stubbornness. It is not ego or obsession or the inability to imagine another life. It is something purer and rarer, a fundamental belief that doing good matters, that helping people matters, that the small kindnesses and the quiet sacrifices add up to something meaningful even if no one ever notices or thanks you. Spider-Man jokes because if he did not joke, he would scream. The humour that has become his trademark is not confidence. It is coping. It is a terrified young man facing monsters that could kill him, finding the only weapon available in that moment, his wit. The quips are armour. The banter is a shield. Beneath the laughter is someone who is scared all the time and fights anyway, because fear is not a reason to stop. This is why children love him. They understand instinctively what it feels like to be small in a world of giants, to face challenges that seem insurmountable, to want desperately to be brave even when bravery feels impossible. Spider-Man shows them that heroes are not born fearless. Heroes are made when frightened people choose to act despite their fear. This is why adults love him. They understand from experience what it feels like to juggle responsibilities that multiply faster than hours in the day, to disappoint people who deserve better, to watch dreams slip away because life keeps demanding immediate attention. Spider-Man shows them that failure is not final, that you can mess up your job and your relationships and your finances and still be a hero, that the measure of a person is not whether they fall, but whether they rise. This is why Spider-Man translates across cultures, across languages, across borders that usually divide humanity into incompatible tribes. The specifics of Peter Parker's life are American, but the essence of his story is universal. Every culture has known struggle. Every society has produced young people who feel overwhelmed by expectations they did not choose. Every human being has faced the question that Peter Parker answers every time he puts on the mask. When you have the power to help, do you have the right to refuse? Spider-Man says no. Spider-Man says that power creates obligation, that ability demands action, that standing aside while others suffer is a kind of violence even if your hands stay clean. This is not a comfortable message. It is not an easy philosophy to live by. It asks more of us than most of us want to give. But it is true. We know it is true, even when we wish it were not. And seeing Peter Parker live by that truth, seeing him sacrifice and struggle and suffer for it, makes us believe that maybe we could live by it too. Maybe we could be a little braver, a little more generous, a little more willing, to help even when helping costs us something. Spider-Man does not save the world by being the strongest or the smartest or the most powerful. He saves the world by being the most determined, by refusing to quit, by embodying the stubborn, irrational, beautiful human belief that one person can make a difference, that kindness matters, that the fight is worth fighting even when you cannot see the victory. Uncle Ben died in an alley in Queens, killed by a thief that Peter could have stopped. That death broke something in Peter Parker. But it also built something, a foundation of purpose that has supported every heroic act he has ever performed. Ben Parker never wore a costume. He never threw a punch at a supervillain. He was just a man who believed in responsibility, who tried to teach that belief to his nephew, who died before he could see what his lessons would become. But his legacy saved the world, again and again and again. That is the heart of the Spider. Not the powers, not the costume. Not the villains or the love interests or the multiverse of variants wearing the same symbol. The heart is simpler than any of that. It is the choice to be good. It is the refusal to let tragedy become an excuse. It is the belief, against all evidence, that tomorrow can be better if we are willing to work for it. Peter Parker was just a kid from Queens. He had no special destiny, no prophecy, no birthright that guaranteed greatness. He was bitten by a spider and given abilities he never asked for, and he made a choice about what to do with them. The wrong choice, at first. The selfish choice. The human choice. And that choice cost him everything. So he made a different choice, and he has been making it every day since. That is why Spider-Man matters. That is why he endures. That is why 60 years after his creation, he remains the most beloved superhero in the world. Because he shows us that the choice is always available, that it is never too late to be better, that the spider can bite anyone, anywhere, in any universe, and whoever it bites can become a hero. All they have to do is choose. With great power comes great responsibility. With great loss comes great compassion. With great fear comes great courage. This is Spider-Man. This is his story. And as long as there are people who need hope, who need proof that ordinary individuals can do extraordinary things, who need to believe that getting back up matters more than never falling down, this story will never end. Beneath the laughter is someone who is scared all the time and fights anyway, because fear is not a reason to stop. This is why children love him. They understand instinctively what it feels like to be small in a world of giants, to face challenges that seem insurmountable, to want desperately to be brave even when bravery feels impossible. Spider-Man shows them that heroes are not born fearless. Heroes are made when frightened people choose to act despite their fear. This is why adults love him. They understand from experience what it feels like to juggle responsibilities that multiply faster than hours in the day, to disappoint people who deserve better, to watch dreams slip away because life keeps demanding immediate attention. Spider-Man shows them that failure is not final, that you can mess up your job and your relationships and your finances and still be a hero, that the measure of a person is not whether they fall, but whether they rise. This is why Spider-Man translates across cultures, across languages, across borders that usually divide humanity into incompatible tribes. The specifics of Peter Parker's life are American, but the essence of his story is universal. Every culture has known struggle. Every society has produced young people who feel overwhelmed by expectations they did not choose. Every human being has faced the question that Peter Parker answers every time he puts on the mask. When you have the power to help, do you have the right to refuse? Spider-Man says no. Spider-Man says that power creates obligation, that ability demands action, that standing aside while others suffer is a kind of violence even if your hands stay clean. This is not a comfortable message. It is not an easy philosophy to live by. It asks more of us than most of us want to give. But it is true. We know it is true, even when we wish it were not. And seeing Peter Parker live by that truth, seeing him sacrifice and struggle and suffer for it, makes us believe that maybe we could live by it too. Maybe we could be a little braver, a little more generous, a little more willing, to help even when helping costs us something. Spider-Man does not save the world by being the strongest or the smartest or the most powerful. He saves the world by being the most determined, by refusing to quit, by embodying the stubborn, irrational, beautiful human belief that one person can make a difference, that kindness matters, that the fight is worth fighting even when you cannot see the victory. Uncle Ben died in an alley in Queens, killed by a thief that Peter could have stopped. That death broke something in Peter Parker. But it also built something, a foundation of purpose that has supported every heroic act he has ever performed. Ben Parker never wore a costume. He never threw a punch at a supervillain. He was just a man who believed in responsibility, who tried to teach that belief to his nephew, who died before he could see what his lessons would become. But his legacy saved the world, again and again and again. That is the heart of the spider. Not the powers, not the costume. Not the villains or the love interests or the multiverse of variants wearing the same symbol. The heart is simpler than any of that. It is the choice to be good. It is the refusal to let tragedy become an excuse. It is the belief, against all evidence, that tomorrow can be better if we are willing to work for it. Peter Parker was just a kid from Queens. He had no special destiny, no prophecy, no birthright that guaranteed greatness. He was bitten by a spider and given abilities he never asked for, and he made a choice about what to do with them. The wrong choice, at first. The selfish choice. The human choice. And that choice cost him everything. So he made a different choice, and he has been making it every day since. That is why Spider-Man matters. That is why he endures. That is why 60 years after his creation, he remains the most beloved superhero in the world. Because he shows us that the choice is always available, that it is never too late to be better, that the spider can bite anyone, anywhere, in any universe, and whoever it bites can become a hero. All they have to do is choose. With great power comes great responsibility. With great loss comes great compassion. With great fear comes great courage. This is Spider-Man. This is his story. And as long as there are people who need hope, who need proof that ordinary individuals can do extraordinary things, who need to believe that getting back up matters more than never falling down, this story will never end.